Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast. I am your host, Kate Kavanaugh, and I am so grateful to be with you here today. I am recording on a day where it is -10 and dropping, so we are deep in the heart of winter, but I can feel that lifted heart towards spring, that there's something coming, that we're about to start putting seeds in some trays and we're about to start looking towards the growing season. And I think that gives me some warmth on this cold winter day. I am so excited about today's episode. Today, I sit down with Maren Morgan and Jake Marquez, whose film Death in the Garden is forthcoming. And they have a podcast full of many of the interviews that they've done for the film and are planning a book as well. And I had the pleasure of sitting down with Maren and Jake in the summer of 2022 for what is probably one of my favorite podcast interviews that I have done, where I have been the guest to date. And I want to talk a little bit about their work because I truly think that the work that Jake and Maren are doing is amongst the most important work that's being done right now. And it is because they are really searching and teasing apart and looking at death. And I think that our avoidance of death is a symptom of what is happening culturally for us. And so the work that they are doing to uncover this, to unpack this, to explore this in every facet that they possibly can think of is truly stunning work. And I mean it when I say that I don't think there is more important work being done right now that I am aware of. Their concept is so beautiful. And when I first came across their work, I had this moment where I felt that strange mix of envy, awe, respect, and curiosity about another person's work, where you're just immediately drawn in, and it's complex, right? Like there's some jealousy, but there's some jealousy of, gosh, I wish I had thought of that. And there's some awe of, oh, I love that these people thought of that. And there's some curiosity of how does their process, what is their process, and what are these brains like that came up with this stunning concept. And I think that what you'll see over the course of this podcast episode is that these two individuals are some of the most beautiful thinkers that I've had the pleasure of interviewing. And so I'm really excited to bring you this episode. I really encourage you to dive into Jake and Maren's work through the podcast, eventually through the film, and especially on their Substack. I really enjoy both of their writing, and it's really rich. It has so much depth, and it always leaves me thinking for several days and really turning some of these concepts that they explore over in my mind. And so I'm just going to encourage everybody to seek out to their work. I'm just so excited to dive into this interview that I don't even want to wait. So without further ado, after a little bit of bookkeeping, we have the incredible Jake Marquez and Maren Morgan. Before we dive into the podcast, I have a couple of accounting things that I want to cover, and one of them is actually a small retraction from a previous episode. In the episode with Brian Sanders, he discusses something called the marshmallow test that often is cited as a way to predict whether or not a child has the kind of willpower that will be predictive of later success. And a listener and friend sent a series of follow-up studies that had been done for the marshmallow test that actually indicate that it has no bearing on a child's future struggles or behavioral issues or propensity towards obesity. And so I just want to be transparent about that and to bring this into the podcast. I'll have a link to the article that talks about why this isn't the case in the show notes. And I just wanted to bring that to everyone's attention. I want to take a minute to thank the affiliate codes that I have below. These are not sponsorships. These are just ways of supporting the podcast while offering y'all awesome discounts on products that I use every single day. This includes Home Goods from Home of Wool, where we get all of our non-toxic wool, Ecotex, and GOTS certified mostly wares for our bed, including pillows, duvet covers, mattress covers, and body pillows, as well as blue light blocking and red light therapy devices from Bone Charge, and the amazing Farm True ghee that we use multiple times a day, every day in our kitchen. You can find the discount codes in the show notes, and these help support the show while giving you access to discounts on incredible products that I actually use and recommend. So I encourage everyone to check that out. And if you are enjoying the podcast, may I just ask that you make sure that you hit subscribe, leave a rating and review. It helps people find the show, and it helps us build more momentum around laying the groundwork and what it means to get curious about the machinations that underlie mind, body, and soil. Yeah, it's easy.
But it's like there was, with my time with the Hare Krishnas, I heard this story from the Bhagavad Gita, which there is an archer teaching his pupils how to shoot bows and arrows. And, he has 3 kids get up and take one shot, and he has like this stuffed crow in a tree. That's their target. And the first kid shoots, and it just kind of like totally goes over the crow, not even close. The second kid hits the crow, but it kind of hits it like in the tail feathers, like a really sloppy shot. And the third kid shoots and hits it right dead center in the eye. And so, the teacher kind of goes through each kid, and he asks the first kid, "What were you looking at?" He's like, "Oh, I was looking at the tree." And he asks the second kid, "What were you looking at?" "Oh, I was looking at the branch." And then he asks the third kid, "What were you looking at?" And he's like, "I was looking at the small, tiny reflection on the bird's eye," And so I feel like when we started the project, we had such a laser focus, and we still do, but keeping that focus on the glint off the bird's eye sometimes gets really exhausting. And sometimes you see other reflections and you think it's that reflection, but it's not. And so
and it's almost like behind the bird, like everything has been complexifying as we've been doing the project, and it's like it's like we're in this sort of hyper realism, and everything is becoming more and more and more clear, but at the same time that has a very almost like obscuring effect, because then it's like, what even is real if what we thought was real isn't real? But it's so complicated.
Yeah, wanting to say things right and do things right and do them effectively while also getting as much in there as possible, I think has been a hard task, because obviously with these topics we all talk about, there's so many interesting ideas in tangential regions of all these things, but it's always this refrain, especially when you're making a film and a book and pieces of writing. It's like, okay, but what's necessary, and what does the culture need, and why do certain pieces of art strike home within a culture more than others, and what's fluff, and what is the unfortunate baby that needs to be thrown out with the bathwater on this one? It's kind of that confusing space that we are always living in. And so I'm always grateful for the moments where I'm like, oh, okay, I know what we're doing, and I can see it. And then sometimes I'm awake at night, and I'm just like, I have no idea what we're doing.
And then on top of it too is like our relationship is so tied up in it too.
Oh yeah.
And so because we started dating, what was it, like 5 months before we started the project?
It'll be 3 years exact in January.
Yeah, and so the fact that it's also I was in my early 20s when we met, and now I'm on the other half of my 20s, and so I'm going to be 27 next year. Jake's going to be 30. We've grown up together in a big way, but having our relationship so tied up in it too is it's like we're growing as human beings, we're growing as partners, and then we're also doing this thing that feels almost divinely inspired. I hesitate to say that because I think sometimes people don't understand what it feels like to be kind of touched by that sort of inspiration and be like,
I do.
Oh, I'm being given an opportunity that if we don't grab this, that opportunity is going to go to somebody else. And so we have to take advantage of that opportunity and grab it. And we did. And, you know, there's been so much stuff that's been brought up and so many feelings around like scarcity and poverty mindset and just insecurities and imposter syndromes that come up. And, you know, so it's like on the one hand, we're trying to do this project, but on the other hand, we're just trying to figure out how to be humans in this world at the same time. And so trying to add a layer of, I guess, not realism, but like being realistic about who we are, being honest, you know?
That's the hilarious contradiction that anybody who wants to criticize the world as it is also simultaneously has to live in the world as it is, which requires money and capital and all the bullshit that we so hate, but it's not gone yet. It's still there.
Yeah.
And so it's this, the
traumas that come up that we have to then deal with, and then they all sort of have this weird tangential relationship to the project at the same time.
Of course they do.
Everything. It's so bizarre. It's bizarre to also be. Sorry, I'm kind of ranting now.
No, go ahead. This. And I have a thought after. Go ahead though.
You know, I feel very fortunate, and Jake and I talk about this a lot, to, you know, because it's not like this is just a movie for us or this is just a book for us. This is really a life path that's going to kind of splinter off and fractal and turn into all of these different life paths. But having that sort of mission has such a potency to it and such a power to it. And there's such a significance to it that is, you know, it challenges us every day to keep working towards it and working to make it work. And yeah, it's a lot, but it's awesome. I mean, like, thank God for it.
Yeah, no kidding.
There's something to be said, I think, from what you're trying to get at is almost the heart. And I think that when we're seeking the heart of the matter, I mean, the heart of everything, right? Like, I mean the Big Bang, like the thing that is at the center of everything, every atom, every fiber. And I feel like you guys are trying to get as close to that as you can. And anytime you're looking at death, you're looking at everything. You're looking at our relationship to aliveness. You're looking at love, right? And to have incorporated this into your relationship journey, you are looking at all the things that fundamentally make us human: life, death, love, our food, and looking at how that has brought us here to this present moment, to this section of reality, and what that means about us on our human journey as you go on your own human journeys. And so I imagine that you're looking for this thread, but it is almost the mother thread, right? Where you pull it, you're pulling everything else. And so as you begin to try to tease out what belongs in this film, in this book, in these interviews, it's everything. I mean, it just kind of, it all must be raining down on you from my perspective, because I find that with this podcast.
Yeah. I mean, it really is. And you're right, because the process of, I think, our lives to this point and in this project has been constantly trying to find what is the actual, at the core of all these things. What is at the thread of all these things? And it's been a constant process of removing extra things that got in the way of us seeing that real thing. And I think that's why we called it Death in the Garden. And, you know, we can go off on so many tangents of what that could mean for anybody. I mean, that can have a lot of meanings. You know, that can be biblical, that can be philosophical, that can be so many things to people from our culture. But it really was attempting really hard to ask the questions, okay, it's pretty obvious that things are not going well here on Earth. Just by our own innate sensibilities, it feels wrong, and historically, you know, we can point to things are not going well. Why? And we're supplied a lot of answers for those whys that we're all asking. You know, your generation, our generation that we collectively share, the young people coming behind us, it's on everybody's mind of why things are so bad. How did we get here? What do we do about it? And we're being given so many of these answers. And we have both, at various points of our time, believed those answers and been given those easy, simple solutions to these really, really painful things that are happening on Earth. And as we began to earnestly make this project and try for ourselves to figure it out and create something that would encapsulate hopefully some truths, we began to understand that we had embodied these simple solutions and that the world at large was adopting them full-heartedly. And so getting to that really core truth seems to us to be the only thing that really matters at this point. Everything else can fall away, you know, and we can kind of get into some more details of that here soon, but everything else is secondary to this core thing. Until that core thing is really looked at, reevaluated, and shifted, nothing really else matters as far as trying to amend these problems.
Yeah. And, you know, talking about what lies have we accepted about the way that the world works. And just as you were speaking, I was just thinking about, you know, I think that I've always felt in my life, like, why do we act like agriculture is different than social justice, than different than my own psychology, my own traumas, my own personal history, my ancestral traumas, like, and, you know, different than colonialism. It's like all of these things are so interconnected in ways that we just maybe don't understand because we've been conditioned to believe that these things can be siloed and exist in vacuums. And that's just not true. They all do have connections and they all do matter. And so it's been this process of, you know, needing to break open the lie, like look at the lie and be able to discern what is the lie and what's actually the truth. Also is like you have to have both sides of the coin in order for it to make any sense, in order to actually be able to utilize the truth in any kind of positive way. And yeah, so it's a lot. It feels all over the place sometimes, but then I'll have these moments of catharsis where I'm just like, oh wow, everything is right on time. Like you know, as above, so below. All of this stuff makes sense. Like me healing is also the earth healing at the same time, and like recognizing the interconnectedness of all of that stuff makes this feel so much bigger than just what we're doing, you know, or just our own lives. It feels it feels archetypal in a collective sense, you know. And I think there's also a lot of people going on this journey with us, you know. Like there's not only just the people that are following our podcast, but all the people that we're learning from all the time, including yourself, you know. This is a collective movement that is happening right now. And yeah, we just have to figure out how to keep having good conversations about what's actually happening here.
I'm curious, and this might be a little tangential, but I'm curious how you develop a compass or a barometer for lies and truth, because I think that one of the things that when you do this work, when you start to tease all of this out, you begin to see that there are lies that we've been told, there are illusions, and maybe somewhere there is truth. But I think that is a diaphanous and hard to hold term. And I'm curious how you tease that out and what that's meant to you as people. I mean, that compass.
That's a really good question. There's this line that comes up. We were watching a film. I forget what the film was. Like last year, and
it was about Vietnam
and like it was really great. But there's this line in there where one of these kind of stoner hippie characters is confronted by like one of like these politicians or a capitalist, and the guy asks the hippie a question. He goes, "You asked that question in the form of a lie," and I love that line, you know. But I think one of our favorite authors, Daniel Quinn, you know, he wrote this book called "When They Give You Lined Paper, Write Sideways," and the whole book is about questioning the premise always, even if it turns out to be true. Question the premise in which things are presented to you, and try to place yourself always as a Martian anthropologist. Imagine you're not a human, you're an alien traveling the galaxy, and you come across a planet with life, and you have an opportunity to look at that planet objectively because it has nothing to do with you. So you can see the life on that planet doing what it's doing, and you can sit back and say, oh wow, that's a really dumb thing to do. That's really dangerous. That's really sketchy. Or wow, this little planet has done something really beautifully and harmonious. And So that's kind of how I frame it, is always questioning the premise, always seeing if there's a lie that's kind of been infused within questions or assumptions. And that's a practice. That's a muscle that I'm still working at, and I still find myself not doing as good of a job as I could with really pulling back.
Yeah, I mean, we're really severed from our intuition in the modern world. I think that that's also by design. I think that the way our entire education system is set up is to make you appeal to authority, not think for yourself, and believe that that's critical thinking, is being able to read a book and basically like absorb whatever the person's opinion is and believe that that's your own opinion. And so I think that it's a lot of sort of unspooling that thread of like, okay, wait, what do I actually think? What do I actually think about this? And confronting when we disagree with people and being okay with that, and then, you know, figuring where to go from there.
I had an educator on named Will Roosh many episodes ago who's he sort of specializes in heterodox thinking for high school age kids. And he talks a lot about the education system that most of us grew up in, teaching us what to think, not how to think. And I think that when you grew up in that system, and it's funny because this is the third interview that this has come up in the last 3 interviews, that system really shapes our view of the world, and it becomes then a process of how you tease out your own intuition, how you tease out what you've been sold as truth that might be a lie, or the illusions that you begin to and Josh and I were talking about this the other day, and it was like when you start chipping at the painting, right? It's like a frieze on a wall or something, and you're like, oh, I think there's something underneath here. And you kind of get a little chip off, and then all of a sudden the entire thing just starts to crumble. And you're faced with having to completely reorder your view of the world and of everything. And it takes you back to that, having to question everything, which I think is a healthy and fun standpoint to come at the world from.
Yeah, and you know, you can always risk sort of just being a contrarian, and that's always something that I think is, you know, people have to be mindful of when we sort of enter, when you have that like epiphany moment where you're like, oh my God, everything's a lie. You can kind of get into this place of not really like having a stance and not really knowing where to put your footing because the ground is shifting so much.
Or anything that it does seem to be kind of in the zeitgeist that you're told to believe becomes a false lie, and you're unable. That's the second, I think, most damaging thing, is that then people have no basis for reality and they can't hold on to anything. So it's that fine line of, oh, I was really lied to, I need to reconnect with my innate sensibilities, but also like maybe not everything's a lie. Yeah, or you know, just how discernment doesn't mean that you have one opinion and then you go like 180 degrees to the other side. It's like you need to actually start incorporating all of the perspectives in order to actually know what you think about things. It's like you know, that's why I think it's so funny, like how many I have become disenchanted politically over the past 3 years, which I think a lot of people have. But I just think it's hilarious how many leftists are now conservatives. It's like, that's no. Like abandon the whole thing. Abandon shit.
Two sides, same coin.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They're two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I'm like,
abandon
have a little
ship.
bit more imagination.
Yeah,
like, let's go somewhere else. Like, none of this is working. So, but so it's like, I feel like, you know, we live in really interesting times where the sort of heterodoxy is becoming more common, but that has everybody is susceptible to finding a dogma in any direction. And so it's like, it's so important to continue working the muscle of intuition, using discernment as a practice. You know, it's not enough to like land on an opinion, because it's like the world is shifting all the time. And so, you know, it's not easy. It's definitely not easy. And I feel like I've been kind of lucky in my life, because I feel like I learned really, really early on that objectivity is a really challenging thing to actually have. I just remember, you know, growing up post 9/11, and like people, being really Islamophobic, and me just being interested in that and wondering why that was, and just, having these really uncomfortable conversations with people where I would kind of talk about, I'd be like, not like defending terrorists, but being like, can't you understand, like, what if you grew up in that world, what you would think? Like, and so it's like from a very, very young age, I was just very aware that, like, my perception of the world is but one example of how to understand the world, and everybody else has a totally different experience of life, has a different understanding of, who is their enemy and who is on their side, and what is, I've always just been kind of open to that. So I feel like it's a little bit easier for me to kind of like hold the space for like a million different perspectives, whereas, maybe if that doesn't come as naturally for some people, then it might be a little bit more of like a friction, but I don't mind it too much. Yeah. I think it's just fun.
I think that's interesting. Really important, because I think that our perspectives, right, like our individual perspectives, are what create our reality. And so we have to leave room for the millions, billions of other realities that exist alongside ours, built on perceptions of the world that come from, it's intergenerational, and it's the stories and the narratives and the mythology that we share within different cultures and within shared cultures that really shape how we see things. Maybe this is actually a good place. One of the things that I love about your work is talking about the garden and all of the facets that this can take on, that it can mean a lot of different things. And I think that's important. And I would love to unpack what it means for you. From this perspective, like right now, what we're talking about, there is this story, right, of Genesis, where all of a sudden maybe we're not as conscious, and then we come into consciousness of the dualities of good and evil and chaos and order. And that's one iteration of the garden, I'm sure. And I'm sure there are many more. And so that's something that I'd really like for you guys to unpack.
Oh man. Okay. This is a good one. This is the one we can go off on for a really long time. So I think maybe I'll start, if that's okay. I know you'll have so many good things to say about this. The symbology of the garden is so, pun unintended, fruitful in so many ways. It can be applied and reevaluated and put over so many aspects. I think the one thing that we think about a lot too is, all right, so we have, the Genesis version, or at least what has been handed down to us from the rewritten version of the Bibles over the years of the Garden of Eden. And I think there are a number of people who have really pointed that, like, the actual story of the Garden of Eden, now we'll get historical about this for a second, that came from the Semites, and the Semites were the ancestors of the Hebrews. So by the time the Hebrews got the Garden of Eden story, they didn't even know what their ancestors meant by that story. So that story was written by the Semites, and these were pastoralists in what we would now call the Middle East or the Fertile Crescent. And I really like this story, and I like this kind of different perspective change on this story because it makes it so much more practical and actually very human. And there's a different way of seeing the story. It's that this story was written because, and this goes to, the dawn of agriculture and this point 10,000 years ago that every anthropologist and archaeologist and historian wants to point to as either the best moment in humans' history or the worst moment in humans' history. The moment we started agriculture was the start of civilization and the start of everything we know, and that was either the best thing or the worst thing, depending on who you ask. If you were to ask the Semites, it was the worst thing because up until that point, humans had lived essentially in the hands of the gods and had respected the fact that it wasn't up to them on how to run the world and who got to live and who got to die, including themselves. And living in that truth and living in that inescapable truth of the universe was comforting, and it was the foundation of their worldview and their stories and their narratives. And then out of another area of the Fertile Crescent comes the wheat and cattle people, the agriculturalists, the tillers of the earth. And this is potentially where the actual story of Cain and Abel comes from, We have, and it's not actual brothers, it's figurative brothers. It's one group of humanity and another group of humanity butting heads with different worldviews. One wants to till the earth and control and dominate and choose who gets to live and control nature and control the seasons and control when food is there. And the others are perfectly content with living in the hands of the gods. And so this story of Cain killing Abel all over the world, I find, is a very fascinating story, because Cain is still killing Abel every chance he can get. Right now, the Messiah are being kicked out of their ancestral lands all throughout Africa, all over the world, in South America, all the Abels of the world who are trying to live in that old story of living in the hands of the gods is they are being killed all over the world. And so to me, in many ways, the garden represents this point in the human story that wasn't utopia, it wasn't a paradise, there wasn't this complete ignorance and naivety within humanity. It's just that we were comfortable living with the state of affairs as the world wants us to live, as the earth is the laws that the earth is still as they are. The rules have never changed. It's just that there was a point in time when humanity was okay with that, and we were comfortable with that, and we knew that everything died and everything lived, and that our lives required the death of other things, and that we were going to die and one day feed something else. And that was beautiful to them, and that was part of this fantastic garden we lived in. And the eating from the tree of knowledge was that awareness of, oh, wow, I can try to pretend that I get to choose who lives and who dies. And so every day we are enacting that story. Every day we are eating from that apple. And I think that's the symbology that has really helped me, is that it's not that we're trying to get back to this paradisical place, this utopia where everything is grand. It's just that we get okay with the way things are. We look at the universe and all of its incredible beauty and balance and elegance, and we say, that's the way it should be. And we have to get comfortable with that, and we have to be okay with that. And we have to live with that, the fact that it is hard, but it's also beautiful once we accept it. And so that's kind of my initial response to the garden narrative.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because, I always think it's interesting that it is called a garden, and then we start agriculture, and so there's like a difference between those two things, right? Like, I think that a story that includes a fall, a mythology that includes something that's such a conflict point, right? Like everything is good, and then this thing happens, and then the story really begins, right? Like that's sort of how the first that book of Genesis is sort of structured. I think it's interesting. I mean, it calls to mind that something did happen, that something did happen to the people who created this story. Something disrupted what had been a continuous line of things feeling good and things being good, and there being a world that made sense, and then all of a sudden it's upturned and it no longer makes sense. So I think that's important. And to be honest, I don't know enough about like other mythologies to maybe even be able to make this claim, but I do know that the Turtle Island stories are very different. From that, the creation stories are definitely different. It's so much. It's like they stayed in the garden, right? And I think that it's important also to acknowledge that agriculture wasn't invented 10,000 years ago. People had been doing gardening types of activities, for maybe as long as humans have been. Maybe 50,000 years ago. Who knows? Who knows how long people have been doing this type of thing?
Yes.
It didn't just become relevant. Like quote unquote relevant until we started this civilization building thing. And so I think it's always important to make that distinction, that it's like, I don't think that God, or whatever we understand as God to be, creation, life, just like the universe, the direction of the teleology of life, I don't think that it has any issue with gardening. I think it has an issue with this totalitarian agriculture where we control everything, and where we think that we have dominion over everything, and that we're not co-creators of creation. And so I think that the story of the Garden of Eden, it harkens to the fact that humans have the ability to be co-creators and stewards in an interesting way. That's something like we can't create soil by ourselves. We have to utilize ruminant animals and understand them and have a relationship with them in order to do that. I mean, like you think of a CAFO, that's not creating soil. that's not creating anything really. That's just like a betrayal of the contract that we made with these animals. Versus if you go to, you know, your farm or someone else's farm where there's a relationship and there's a reverence for those animals, you are in a co-creative process with those animals, and they're doing more. You can't do that on your own. I can't do that on my own. But with the relationship we have with the rest of creation, we can be good facilitators of life, and we can create beauty. You know, I think a lot about like how you know, what America looked like before the colonists came here, and all of the indigenous people died of disease, and then all of a sudden it was this wasteland, you know, like, whereas like it was very, very populated by people, and very clearly populated by people. Like there were roads, there were farms, there were gardens, there were people living here, and then 90% of the people died. And so then all of these colonists come over and they're like, wow, what a wilderness, like what, you know, and it wasn't. And so, you know, when I think about the garden, when I think about Earth, I just find myself like really, really loving humanity and loving humanity's role in it. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's kind of an uncomfortable take for a lot of people right now, because I think that there's a lot of misanthropy right now. I think a lot of people don't like to think of humans as having an integral positive role. But we do. Yeah. And I, you know, that's a hill I will happily die on.
Me too.
But, you know, so it's like, you know, the language that we use when we talk about this, it's like the garden, that connotes a human relationship with it. It's not like the garden was just functioning on its own with like, I mean, it was in a sense, but it's like humans were part of it. Like, you know, and we could disappear and the earth will go on in its own way and creation will continue in its own way, but it doesn't have to, because humans do have a positive role here. Yeah. We just need to remember how to do it.
You know, and it forces us to ask, you know, nature gives rise to a species not for a reason. There's a niche to be filled. And as Maren's pointing out, some people would hate to think that we evolved to be the caretakers or the stewards or the orchestrators of certain aspects about this garden, this self-replicating system the earth is trying to create, and that we do have a role here. We just forgot what that role is, and we're telling ourselves a very lost story about what that role is. And we can get into it because we love all those, you know, the archetypes, but I do want to kind of say on this garden piece that's kind of outside the biblical aspect, which you're alluding to, is that there is such a push to return to an agricultural system that's regenerative. Regenerative agriculture is on the rise. People are trying to return to the land in a way, and the motif and the ideas of having your garden and tending your garden and treating the earth as a garden are coming back. But for us, and my forays into veganism and permaculture and tropic gardening and all these things, I felt keenly aware that we were missing like some kind of crucial philosophical points here, is that there is death in the garden. If you want the garden, there must be death. Mm-hmm. There must be blood in the soil. And until we shed the ideals that we want to avoid that, then we're never going to get the garden. We're never going to have a healthy, functioning garden. Yeah,
and you know, and I think that like what you're saying, when we talk about death, I feel like it's like I'm always thinking about what is our response to death usually in this world, and it's in this culture. And it's usually that we want to control it and we want to tamp it down and we want to make it not happen. Mm-hmm. And so I think that what people really like, and this is obviously like we're such outsiders to agriculture, but from my perspective, it's like the best way to actually embody that the relationship of being a gardener is to accept that we're not in control here. And if we can relinquish that control and stop trying to keep controlling things, that's how we enter that space of like, because the thing is, it's like regenerative agriculture can be a program of control just like anything else. Yes. Permaculture can be a program of control. And so we have to be willing to like look and be like, am I like imposing this or am I like part of this?
I want to bring a little piece in, and I want to get into this misanthropy and humans' role here with nature, but I don't want to leave the garden just yet, as it were. And I want to bring in a kind of funny piece, which is Jordan Peterson has a really interesting view of the symbology in that story and a representation of chaos and order and the known and the unknown. That in the garden, it feels like order. And then you have this serpent that's representative of chaos, which is the unknown. It is all the things that we can't know, that we don't know, right? Death being one of those many things. And that within the garden feels like order and structure, but in that sort of yin and yang and masculine and feminine, we need both chaos and order, and we need those to fit together. And that story is the coming together of chaos and order in what we need. And my husband and I were talking about this morning, sort of in preparing for this, and we were talking about how nature orders everything, right? So there's this idea that from a cellular level, the base structure of everything comes from death, right? We need death in the garden to create life. And that within that, death is order. That it's order because it's inevitable, but it's chaos because it's entirely unknowable. And then within that same container, you have this space where nature is order because it's the only thing we know. It is our terra firma. It is our materia prima. And so it's the only thing, but it's chaos because it can't be controlled. And then, so you have like all of those dichotomies, and then you throw humans in the mix with a desire to control what they can't control, or to order what is inherently chaos. And here we are.
Yeah.
I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really interesting that he sees it the opposite, that the garden represented the stability and everything, and then the serpent tempted us with the uncertainty, because I would say, it's the complete opposite. The certainty said, no, you can control things. You get to decide when food shows up. Because everybody there's so many theories of why agriculture started. Why around 5 places on Earth, almost simultaneously, did humans decide to start growing floodplain grains? And then from those floodplain grains, here we are. Why in that time? Because it's back-breaking work. Also, the moment we started eating grains, we got shorter and more malnourished. So why did this trade happen? We were incredibly healthy organisms before this transition, and there's so many theories. And my theory, the fun theory is, right now there is this. Have you heard of the Younger Dryas impact theory?
Yes.
So that's kind of coming.
Do you want to explain it a little bit, though, just for everybody listening?
Yes, absolutely. And there's so many fascinating things about this, but there's this huge group of scientists right now doing a bunch of incredible work showing that so if we look at the end of the last ice age, right? The last ice age started to end about 50,000 years ago and ended about 10,000 years ago. So about a 40,000 year period where it was slowly warming and warming and warming. The ice age was ending, and this is, that's the very historical event. There's all those fun cartoons about it. And then about 12,000 years ago, it got cold overnight. Really cold, and then really hot, and then really cold, and then really hot. And then the ice age went back to normal and started ending again, and then finally ended. And nobody really knew what this event was. And so this Younger Dryas period is what it's called, is this strange, about 1,000-year period where the weather just gets really wacky, and really nobody really knew why quite yet. There's a theory now that a series of asteroids hit the North American ice sheet and expelled a bunch of particles into the atmosphere, causing a greenhouse effect and causing global flooding, and which would also point to why essentially every ancient culture has a deluge story. The Noah story isn't the only version of that story. Many cultures have that story of essentially all life getting wiped out. It would explain why almost all the megafauna went extinct, yes, gradually by human hand, but also the fatal blow may have been this deluge. Anyways, so I start thinking about this, and some people have thought about this as well, as this could be the impetus to start agriculture. Overnight, everybody dies and all the food is gone. There's nothing left to hunt. There's nothing left to gather. Every ecosystem is in disarray and trying to find balance again. And when you have flooding, you also get things like rice. You get things like all these grains that those are the pioneer plants. Those are the emergency plants. When an ecosystem is disrupted, those seeds are the first ones to grow to keep the soil, get things started, and then they put down their seeds and don't show up until the next flood. And so I think this sheer lack of control, this sheer horror, the terrifying event that was the Younger Dryas period really imprinted on the collective global human psychology of like actually there's no way to eat unless we grow grains. There's no food left, and so I think that fear and that terror really instilled within many different societies around the world to start agriculture. And I think that imprinting on our brain has never really left us. I think it was so traumatic and so horrible that of course we started agriculture.
Yeah, I mean the sea levels rose like 400 feet,
overnight. Yeah,
like it would have been a catastrophe. Especially if people in the Fertile Crescent, all of a sudden the Mediterranean Sea exists. There's this big deluge when the Gibraltar Strait just opens up, and then all of a sudden this entire area, which was probably plentiful of food, and it maybe it wasn't all of a sudden, but there's a really great podcast about the history of the Sumerians. Called it's Fall of Civilizations podcast. It's really, really good. But he talks about this too. It's this isn't like a super fringe way of understanding history. It's kind of common knowledge that a lot of these land masses that we are so comfortable with today, and we think that they're so permanent, are relatively new.
Mm-hmm.
Actually,
and not as permanent as we might think.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, subject to change. Absolutely. And so, I think that it's funny with regards to climate change. It's like we were kind of all in this long summer where everything was just kind of good. And then it occurred to us that, oh shit, maybe things actually change on this planet. Maybe the earth is alive in a way, and maybe things do shift around. And maybe there's this idea of stability is a bit of an illusion.
And I think the initial question you're asking here, or idea about the human balance of chaos and order, and whether or not we find more order or chaos within the world we've created, or within kind of in the hands of the living world, is a very interesting one. If we look at hunter-gatherer societies of today, I think they probably do find a lot of order, but also a practice of letting go. I think every account I've read of hunter-gatherers, they laugh a lot, because if they don't laugh a lot, the chaos of life gets to you. Oh, the hut blew over again. They laugh and we build it. Oh, the animals aren't here, so we move. And it seems that they have a capacity of accepting the uncertainty of what the weather is going to do, where the food comes from, who's going to get sick in the society. Is somebody getting picked off by a predator? I think there's so much variability that I think that the garden does represent, at least to me, and what I can tell from people living in the garden, that it is unpredictable, but it's beautiful, and it's where most of the mystery and magic of life comes from.
Yeah, and just to kind of go back to the story and Jordan Peterson's take on it, and I don't know enough about it to really parse it out what exactly he thinks about it, but I do think it's interesting because it is sort of a paradox to view nature as the order, and then the chaos. Because to me, it's interesting to think of the serpent as an agent of chaos, because what ended up happening when we ate the fruit is that then we started to control everything, and we had this belief that we could order things, and we could order things better than nature could, and so it's this sort of I like the way that Daniel Quinn describes the eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and how in that moment our eyes opened up and we thought that we could be God. We thought that we could be gods. We thought we could control the world and that we could do it better. And I think that that's something that is obvious. It's everything that humans do, we can do better than we for the past 10,000 years, we've been thinking that we can order life better than nature can.
Yeah.
And in a way, but then there's that other paradox where it's but we are good co-creators, and that is a good thing, and that is part of our role. It's we just have to understand our place within that role and not go overboard with it, and not think that we are in control just because we have this ability to order and to garden and to do things really, really well, as we have done. But, you know, I think one of the things that has been coming up for us a lot recently is this shift into now humans are obsolete, so let's give the ordering of the world to machines. You know, these like hyper they're not intelligent. I mean, they're algorithms, like, you know, skimming over databases, but yet the world has shifted so much to believe that humans are so bad, yet that we need to give over the reins to the machines and be like, oh, like people literally say that. People literally say the world would be better if it was ordered by the AI. Like I've seen people, actual human beings, think that. And I think it's like no one's in control here. Why do we think that anything needs to be in control of this earth and this universe?
Yeah.
Like, what if no one is?
Yeah.
Or what if there's an element of Earth being in control? That sort of Gaia theory where there is change and momentum and shifting. I am curious from your perspective, because I think this relationship, humans' relationship to Earth, right? And there's a relationship. There's a relationship on an individual level of what I or the two of you feel in your relationship to what it means to be a human on Earth and in this garden. And then there are different layers of cultural relationships. And I think the overarching conversation right now is this misanthropy, this idea that humans are a blight on the earth, and this separation and schism that when we talk about nature, when we talk about the environment, we talk about it as if it's something outside and that we are not included within that space.
Absolutely.
And I'm curious, like, where are we with that, and how did we get here?
Well, I think there's a lot of points on that. I think we have to begin identifying the mythologies of the culture we live in, which is the fun game of people not thinking that we actually have a mythology, because we think we have transcended that. We're in the scientific age. We don't have a mythology. And there's a lot of
some
aspects
hubris there.
too. Yeah, exactly. Which is the funny part, because that's what makes us human. The two really, I mean, there's many things that make us human, but the two big aspects of humanity that kind of separate us from not only the other hominids, but the rest of life, is that we are really good at making technology and we're really good at making culture. And those two things are feedback loops. The moment we became hominids, we were making some sort of technology, and the culture we had decided which technology we made, and the technology reinforced the culture, so on and so forth.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so when we understand that we do indeed have a cultural mythology, it's impossible to be human and not have a cultural mythology. We have to start identifying some of those bullet points within the story. And this mythology is ambient. Nobody sits us down ever and says, this is the story we believe, Maybe if you're religious, you get that version of that story. But let's say you're a liberal kid in elementary school, you're not going to get a straight up answer. You're just going to hear it ambiently through cartoons, through the TV, through the radio, through the way your parents fight, through the marketing, whatever it is, you're going to hear that narrative. And some of the ones that I think are important to these points that you have raised is that, one, humans are of a separate and higher order of being. So yes, we're animals and we're creatures, but we're kind of separate, we're distinct. And if we were in a great chain of being, which doesn't actually exist, we'd be at the very top, basically like angels to the rest of life. We're special. That, and also that so that'd be point one. And then point two is that ultimately, there is one right way to live, and we are living it, and we are ultimately on the path of humanity's ultimate destiny. So even though things are bad and crazy, it's okay, because this is our destiny, and there's only one right way to live, and there's no alternative. Paul Kingsnorth calls it Tina. There is no alternative. That's kind of this ambient narrative. It was like, well, but this is what is supposed to happen. This is our trajectory. So if we accept that this is our ultimate destiny, this industrial world that we're creating, when we look out and we see the horrors, when we see the poverty, when we see the disease, when we see the cruelty and the war, what do we have to tell ourselves to justify the concept that we're on the right track? Well, humans were just inherently flawed. We're bad, we're broken, and we're trying the best we can to rectify how bad we are with policies and all these social justice movements, because to get to our ultimate destiny, if we're doing all this stuff, it just means we're like kind of rotten and bad on the inside. And if we keep that narrative that we're wrong and we're flawed, we continue to allow it manifesting into the world. I'm a little lost. Where was it going with that?
Well, I'll pick up.
Yes, please do. You know where it's
I
going.
think I know where you're going with it.
I liked that relationship moment. That was a good one.
Yeah, she's good at that.
But I think then what this ends up happening is then we have to coin this term called the environment, and this thing that we're destroying called the environment. And people are so bad, so we need to start putting fences around the environment, and we need to start protecting the environment, because people are inherently flawed and people are inherently going to destroy it. So then we have the past 100 years or so of go back even farther, especially on the East Coast, it's private property. I think that is a way that maybe for certain people, it can connect people with the environment, quote unquote. Whereas if you're urban and you are you grow up in New York City, you're going to have a very limited access to nature, because that land is owned by other people. But if you go into the West, it's very there's open land everywhere, and it's public land and a little bit of private land and a lot of national parks. But so the what we've had for the past 100 years or so is this national park movement, which on its face seems good, but in its own way, it is a way of separating people from the quote-unquote environment, because there are these policies that, are aimed, they have good intentions, leave no trace, is aimed to, make people not litter, which I agree, don't fucking litter. You don't have to do that. But what that ends up translating to as well is this is a place where you go to recreate. You don't actually interact with that landscape in any kind of meaningful way, such as taking rocks or foraging for food or hunting. This is a land that is protected from people. And then you leave, and then you go back to the place that is not the environment, which is your city. And so we have created these, we structurally created these divisions. And when there's all of these laws and rules around how to engage with the landscape, the regulations make sense when we live in a culture that doesn't believe that that they're part of the environment. So it's like they created the problem by inventing the environment, by and de-peopling us from the environment. Mm-hmm. Has then created the circumstances in which the environment needs to be protected from people, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Makes a lot of sense.
So this misanthropy, this placing the blame on humans for the world's problems, in a sense is right. That's it is humans who are dolphins sure as hell aren't killing everything on Earth. It is humans, but is it humans, or is it the stories we tell ourselves? Is it the operating system in which we have all been forced into and that we all ambient believe? Because I think if we are to say it's humans are the problem, then we're going to have a hard time rectifying 3 million years of human evolution and story and background to say that it's humans' fault.
And cultures all over the world that are actively protecting and not destroying the lands that they are intimately a part of.
And so to kind of go back to this notion of the Garden of Eden story, even if you aren't religious, that Genesis story is the foundation of so many people's thinking, whether you know it or not. That human rottenness, flawedness, we're damned, we're cursed, now we need to till the earth for our wrongness, is ambient in all of us. But if we have to ask ourselves, do all cultures tell themselves that story, or are there different Genesis stories? And I don't want to speak on things I don't know completely, but there's another story called Sky Woman that many cultures in North America had, and Sky Woman is a Genesis story that goes along the lines of everything is a gift. It is a gift to be here in this fantastic garden, and everything comes for free. You are given all the food and all the nutrients and all the protection and all the beauty and abundance for free, for nothing, because you deserve it and you're a human. And that incredible story about being grateful for everything that life provides and that you belong on Earth and you are an integral part of that web of life and beauty is in stark contrast to the ones that have been the foundation of Western society.
But I think what you said earlier is really important to just reiterate, is that it's not even what Genesis actually says, it's the way that the culture has interpreted it. Yes. Because what Genesis actually says is this is the fall, don't do this. You don't have to do this agriculture thing. God actually would prefer it if you're a pastoralist. Don't do this thing. It's actually super clear what it's saying. But the way that it's been interpreted by the culture, to me, is like, do people know how to read? Like, that's
what I was saying. Even, by the time the Hebrews got that story, they didn't know what that story meant. The Hebrews were deep agriculturalists. Their ancestors wrote a story that they didn't even understand. So by the time it gets to modern Americans, we sure as hell don't know what that story meant.
Now we have like the Garden of Eden diet with like, we went to like the Creation Museum in Kentucky, and they talk about. Yeah, have you heard of this? There's in Kentucky. There's the Ark. There's the Ark Experience in the Creation Museum, and it's for like evangelical Christians and who believe in
it's
like
a trip. You gotta go.
Believe that the Earth was created 6,000 years ago, and like whatever. Believe whatever you want.
Yeah.
But what's interesting though is that there's a lot of biblical literalism, obviously, and one of the things being that there wasn't death until we ate it, until we fell from the garden. And so like actually veganism and vegetarianism is like a really important sort of tenet of that. It's like, in order for us to get back to this utopian Garden of Eden, we have to stop eating meat and we have to like eradicate death. And so it's just another sort of death denying, trying to control the world sort of delusion. And and obviously this exists in like a lot of different cultures. Like I'm not trying to like alienate Christians or anything like that. I think that all people have I've been saying this to Jake recently. It's like all types of relationships can be toxic. Like all beliefs can be like predicated on bullshit. And just interrogating those things. Like you don't have to like I used to be an atheist, and I'm like super not an atheist at all anymore.
Yeah, same journey.
Yeah, and so I think, but at the same time, I think I was very turned off by religion for good reason. But I think that like it behooves all of us to just like again try to have discernment about all things that we interact with in the world.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was a little bit of a tangent.
No, I like that. And I actually want to bring this back to this. Did you lose me? Can you hear me?
For like 1 second.
Yeah, you're back.
You're back.
Okay, I'm back. Because I think all of this is grasping at control, right? Like this is still, to go back to this idea, we're grasping at control. And I pulled a quote from you, Maren, in your essay, The Legacy of the Men Who Pulled Bread from the Air. And you talk about, we still impose the ideology of control on the living world, this time in the name of saving it. We continue to act as though the living world is a machine for us to tinker with. We've given up the pursuit of the tree of life and have allowed ourselves to be stuck with the curse that God placed upon us. Rather than looking to nature and its cycles and understanding our place in the matrix of life and death, we continue the project of control and domination, further exerting the power of our inventions onto the living community, reducing the planet down to its constituent parts in order to save it. We eat unceasingly from the fruit of that tree every day. At some point, we'll recognize the lunacy of the epistemology and we'll stop fighting the unintended consequences of our pursuit for control with more control.
Damn, lady, that's some good writing.
That's really good. It's really good. And then you bring in this piece that maybe we could surrender our control to the machine and the machine could control it.
Yeah, because it's this interesting, and the fact that it's a human invention too, I think is important. Is that it's like we have to create these. I mean, think about it this way. Like, who was it? Was it Thomas Hobbes who wrote Leviathan? And talking about the body politic and like the importance of needing a governmental structure to control humans, because like humans are just so bad. We have to have this thing that like makes sure that the humans do the right thing and that we don't fuck everything up. I think it's just an extension on that idea, because obviously like the machines are the ideology of the machine comes from the people who are programming the machine, right? Like so it's not detached from humans, and I think that's
it's emergent. If anything, it's an emergent property, entity, organism from humanity, from our conception of technology.
And from a handful of people too. Like I think that's the thing where people are like, well, we should just let the machines control what we do. And it's like, okay, but like who's controlling the machines? Like like these things are not intelligent. They're not actually capable of like creating things that are not derivative of from a human mind.
Well, that's what I'm trying to say from earlier. The culture creates the technology that reinforces the culture. And so, we wrote a piece about AI recently, and our biggest gripe was like, don't let them define art. Let's let us define what art is, and don't let them define intelligence, because it's a type of intelligence. It's the intelligence that has built this world, but it's only a type of intelligence. It's not the same intelligence that created the elegance of photosynthesis. So is it intelligent? Sure, but it's a specific type for a certain end goal, and we have gotten so tunnel vision that there is one type of intelligence on Earth, and we're going to let that version take control. But it doesn't understand anything else about the universe other than what humans can understand.
Yeah, and this idea of control is so interesting. Because it's, we are trying to control the world to save it. We are trying to battle. I mean, it's the same story, right? It's like the serpent was like, you're gods now. And now, you're going to go and like destroy the world believing that you're gods. And so what are we doing? We're continuing to do the same thing. We're still pretending like we're gods. We're still pretending like this story has any kind of bearing in creating a world that makes any sense to anyone. And that to us, I think, is like the most perplexing thing about like being born in 1996 and being like, what is happening here? Like, why is this world so bizarre? And nobody seems to notice, and nobody seems to like question it. It's very taken for granted. But to me, it's always felt like, why are we just doing the same thing again and again and again? Like, why don't we try something new? And it turns out what is new is a lot of like really ancient ideas, actually, like really returning to and having a reclamation to things that are very human and ancestral and based in our understanding of our actual tangible role with things. But it's also very spiritual, and like there's a resurgence of animism coming up from all types of people, but it's not based in control. It's people are having an intuitive feeling that this program of civilization that is predicated on control and mechanizing and reducing everything down doesn't work, actually, and it doesn't actually make any sense. It doesn't make people happy. It makes people insane, and it's also colonizing the whole world. But I think that sorry, I'm trying not to get lost again, but I think that we have a lot of remembering to do as people, and I think that remembering things requires a willingness to step into some unknowns, because we're not remembering things from our past. We're remembering things from our ancestors from thousands of years ago. Yes. We're remembering things from histories that have been completely severed from us. Everybody in the world right now has been separated from the stories that make sense to people. Mm-hmm. And so remembering that, we have to take some serious steps into these realms of intuition and discernment. Those things are really intangible, and I think it really scares people. And so it's easier to be like, instead of taking the responsibility that's required for us to actually do that and do the hard work of like healing ancestral traumas, even like coping with our own traumas from our past and from our parents and stuff like that, that requires a lot of bravery. But I think in a world that feels as messed up as this one does, it makes more sense to be like, let's have something else order it. Let's have Elon Musk. Elon Musk is a rich man. He's a billionaire. So, of course, he's got this sort of thing figured out. So let's give him the reins. We're like, it's like the machine mentality is like humans want to control the world. Yet at the same time, as individuals, we're very terrified of actually taking responsibility for the things that we can control and the things that we can do. And so there's a lot of paradoxes in this conversation, right? Like, there's a letting go and a taking the reins that we all have to do. It's like discerning what can I control? I clearly cannot control the fact that I'm going to die. What I can control, I can be responsible for working through some of my traumas, and making that part of my life's mission to understand where I came from and where I'm going, and do that with intention. That's something that I can do. And so I've been thinking a lot recently about this polarity between freedom and responsibility. Like, you can't have freedom without actually being really responsible for things. You can't have freedom in your relationship without being responsible to maintaining that relationship. You know, and so that's sort of like, these paradoxes are really important for us to try to tango with.
I love that you're pulling in paradox and you're pulling in this idea of balance. I've been thinking a lot about freedom and discipline, and I actually think the word responsibility is it's actually a better word. And I'm curious because we are kind of going on this hero's journey, and this is something that I heard you, Jake, talk about on another interview. Right now, like, each individual is going through, Maren, what you just said. You, of course, cut out a little bit right in between, right at the juicy stuff for me. But we're going through these individual heroes' journey of looking at our trauma, our backstory, whether that's just within our lifetime or whether that's from an intergenerational and going back perspective, and beginning to heal that at the same time that we are breaking away from this sort of greater trajectory that we seem to be almost sort of ushered along. And to break away from it, you have to step into, I am both responsible and I also must surrender to the complete greater unknown. And so there's all these fractals, right? There's these little hero's journey nested in this greater hero's journey of what it means to step off this beaten path, to step off of, you know, what we've been taught, and to go a different direction. And I'm curious what you think those mirrors are as you've been through your own personal journeys, and to kind of do a backwards interview to bring that piece in.
Yeah. Well, I can explain a bit about, you know, my story and things that I see a lot now in a lot of other people because of my own story. You know, long story short, you know, being a post 9/11 kid who hated school from day one, and, you know, just being bitter and wanting so badly to break out and have the freedom of youth, and eventually getting that, but also simultaneously feeling the weight of the world and how, you know, bad things are. I think, like most young people these days, we're just overcome with the tragedy of what is happening on Earth, and it's really hard. And so we look for anything to do to feel like we're not part of that problem and to alleviate that pain. And so in my early to mid 20s, you know, I got very involved in spiritual communities and yoga communities, and then got involved with vegan communities, and ended up traveling the world kind of in this plant-based world and community, and found myself ended up living in a vegan community in Australia, living out of a tent for a while, and, you know, gave up all animal products because I thought veganism was obviously the way to the future, and meat eating just seemed so symbolically the reason why the world was so bad. And how represented how unconscious and greedy and evil humans are, and it does in many ways. But my health failed from that diet, and so because of my health failing from that diet and having to reintroduce animal products back into my diet, I then had to start asking a lot even deeper questions, because if the one thing that I thought was a silver bullet to all the ails of the world wasn't, then that means I had to find a lot of other answers and a lot of other solutions than just this one. And so I kind of had a hero's journey in this little micro way, where I left meat eating and I came back to meat eating, but was a completely different person. And I have, as part of this project, talked to a lot of other vegans or vegetarians and plant-based people who are either doing it for ethical or environmental reasons, having kind of saying that same thing, you know, like, I'm eating meat now, but I'm different and I think about it differently, and going on that journey has completely changed me, and I would never change that. Same for me, you know, people who try to go on their own little pilgrimage towards understanding, even though if I on the outside have my own opinions about it, I'm very grateful, and I try to say in my own way a little prayer or intention that they find themselves doing the full journey, because if you can, if a young person can stop eating meat but come back to eating meat and be completely different, they're never going to eat meat like they used to, or you're never going to do that thing like you used to. If you go out and be a radical environmentalist but realize the mistakes of it, you're going to come back to being a environmentalist, but you're going to be completely different, and you're going to see it different, but you have to go on that journey.
You're going to be Paul Kingsnorth.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, you're going to come back to being just as passionate, just as caring, just as in love with the living world, but you're going to be left with no other option but to be different and to see things differently. And so that's kind of how my journey went, is that I found myself coming back to things, but needing to do them differently. You know, we know so many young people who were vegetarian or vegan at one point, but now they're shepherds. You know, they're not living in a city anymore, but they're eating meat, but they're shepherds. And that intention to want to do right by other living beings, to do right by your health, to have a sense of connection with the living world, and to protect the planet, those are the most beautiful intentions humans can have. And until we really try to live those intentions to the fullest with our whole hearts, we'll never actually find ourselves back in truth. And you know, so yeah, that's kind of how I see it, is that these little micro journeys we take, and maybe ultimately the what we see happening in the world today is kind of humanity's own hero's journey. You know, we got to go through that. We're going through the dark night of the soul. We're on the precipice of nuclear war, everybody having cancer. The world is so toxic, biological collapse. But maybe, just maybe, if we keep going with our truest and highest intentions, we can find ourselves back where we know we belong, back home again. And where that home is, I don't think we know yet, but I think we're on our way towards home.
Mm-hmm. We're in the abyss, but you have to allow yourself to be changed by the process of going through the journey.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And some people don't. Some people, there was definitely opportunity for me to stay the same vegan-minded person. And I know a lot of people who are still in that and still live in a child's version of not only their own lives, but the world as it is and the world that Mother Nature is asking us to be in. Sometimes we get off that journey. Sometimes we get off that train. And, you know, that's what Maren and I are always asking when people see our film or read the book. We don't want you to agree with us. We just want you to figure it out for yourself. We just want to inspire you to keep going on that journey. And if you come to a different conclusion, that's fine. But we don't want people to get off that journey, because we feel like humanity, by and large, at the moment is stepping off of that train, stepping off of that journey. It's right at the end.
Yeah. And there's like a lot of false summits that I think we all have to face in our lives. And it's important to like not get stuck on the saddle and be like, I made it to the top. It's like, no, maybe you didn't make it to the top yet. Maybe you didn't make it to the top of the mountain. And maybe actually the really hard work, now you have to do the scramble to like actually summit.
The responsibility.
Yeah. And I think, you know, just as you were talking, it just occurred to me, it's like how parallel our stories are, but like very, I mean, we talked about this a lot, but for some reason it was like, it really like clicked in my mind that it's like you were sort of escaping the chaos and the uncomfortability with this sense of certainty. Like, I found the panacea, I found the thing, I found the one thing that's going to solve everything. Whereas for me, it was like annihilation. Like I just needed to like numb out, because I too felt so sensitized and so sensitive to everything that was happening in the world. And for me, it was just easier, or like, it's like, I think I was just trying to survive. I think I sometimes say that it was easier, but I really think I was trying to survive by, you know, finding things to sort of fill in to I actually wrote this story, this like little, fairy tale sort of story. I did this workshop, and we were asked to write a story about our lives, like, but from a fairy tale perspective. And I wrote about myself as if I was born with multiple eyes, like more than two eyes. And as I grew up, I just started getting more and more eyes, like as I started to like notice and pay attention to things. And it was so uncomfortable, and I felt so alienated, and I felt so weird, and like that there was something wrong with me, because I was so sensitive and so like just outraged. And you know, my dad would always say to me, like, Maren, you're always screaming at the wind about everything. I mean, ever since I was like 10 years old and I had the consciousness to be able to recognize what was happening in the world, I was just like I couldn't believe that this is how things were happening in the world. And so in this little story that I wrote, I started drinking probably when I was like I was 16, I think. But it was like that drinking made those eyes close a little bit, and it made life like manageable. Yeah, and so I
feel that.
Yeah, like, and so I used it as like a potion, as like an elixir to kind of numb myself to how bad I felt about everything, and about me feeling like I had such an incapacity to do anything about the world. And so, and then there were moments where I would like, my eyes would open up again, and then I would come home and be met with people who never had this problem of having eyes all over their body, and then feeling like, okay, the only way I can survive in this world is if I numb it and make it go away. And then so I feel like I was on one end of like this escapism kind of like polarity, and Jake was on this other end, but like you were escaping through the certainty that you had found, and I was escaping through just like pure like escapism and like delirium and stuff like that.
Trying to escape the truth
in
our own way.
Yeah, exactly. And then I feel like we kind of met at this sort of like cosmic moment where we were both kind of trying to come back to really like actually engaging with the truth. And then it just like, I feel like it just skyrocketed our ability to kind of cope with it, because we finally were like, oh my God, you know what it's like to be covered in eyes and feel so fucking weird.
Yeah, found a like mind and connected those forces.
Yeah, but from very different ends. And I think it's if it's okay if I kind of say this, Kate,
Always.
It's like I think I felt actually a lot of shame about, like, because Jake went on this like very this hero's journey where it's like you really went out there into the world and really did the thing. And I think I felt a bit of embarrassment about like feeling like, oh, I just wasn't strong enough, or I had like, there was an incapacity of my ability to cope, and so that's somehow less than. But I think that they're actually just two expressions of the same feeling, just on the opposite ends of the spectrum. And I think a lot of people are doing what Jake did, and a lot of people are doing what I did. Mm-hmm. And it's more about like, where can you go from there? That is like where the power is, and where you can kind of be emboldened and release the shame of that. Yeah.
It's,
and we're
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, and we're still on that hero's journey, and I think this project shows us every day where we were wrong, or where our perspective changes, and that's a constantly humbling thing. And I'm sure you experience that on your land every day, where you're constantly humbled, you're constantly reminded that maybe you didn't see something right, or that you should change perspective. And I think that's one of the trickiest things for humans to do, but it's so enriching and powerful when you can do it. So I don't want anybody to think that we have any sense of certainty, or that when this film comes out we've landed on anything. It's more of an open question, and an inviting for even bigger open questions, because after certain big truths we all learn in our lives, then it's just possibility, then it's just potential, then who knows where it goes.
I've been thinking a lot. This isn't gonna sound related, but it will be in a second. I've been thinking a lot about death as a portal instead of an end point. And I've been thinking a lot about the nature of something like a black hole, and that we have these journeys where there's so much gravity, and sometimes it's the gravity that you talked about, Maren, where and I have experienced this too, and have coped in the same way. The gravity of everything that is happening in the world closing in on you, and seeing it and feeling it, and wanting to cover all of the eyes. It's so beautiful. And there's also the gravity of the choices I make, Jake, your journey, like the choices that I make have this major impact. And so I want to be precise and intentional with my choices, but maybe not seeing the bigger picture. And I think that we go through these gravitational places as we deal with grief. I think they're both reflections of dealing with this sort of almost existential grief of where the world is right now, and not quite understanding our place in it, having just been born into this time, and feeling that. And I wonder at times if we can allow ourselves to surrender to the gravity of where we are, if we then go through this death process, through this black hole, which on the other side, I can't tell you what's there. The unknown is there. But it is different when we allow it in to really truly feel it. And which is not easy, which is, and I don't want to and still do. I have and still do find ways to not feel the inundation of that grief and of that gravity. But it takes us through death and brings us to death where we can be transformed and then reborn. I mean, in the cycle of nature, like in the image of nature. And also the death of our previous selves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as you were talking, it was just making me think, when we think of, I really like the image of the black hole because I think it has a lot of different layers, has a lot of different meanings. And, one of the things that I feel like the sort of scientific worldview makes us think about black holes as like that is like annihilation, that there's nothing on the other side of it, that it's just darkness, when really there's no way for us to actually know that. We actually don't know. And I think that is where another example of how much we are attached to this idea of the individual, and that our deaths is the utter annihilation of ourselves, and that is like the single most traumatic experience that we can ever go through, because our ego is going to be gone and we're going to be gone. When in reality, when you think about like how we're all part of a community, and that individuality isn't actually a thing, it's actually not true. We're all just relating to each other and all of the rest of the living community. Then the idea of going through a black hole doesn't feel so scary. And so I think that the same metaphor can be extended to human grief. If you're grieving by yourself, yeah, that sucks. That is going to be terrifying. And that's not how humans have ever experienced grief. That's not what our bodies expect. I mean, there's this really amazing book called The Wild Edge of Sorrow that talks about this, that it's all about how grief is meant to be felt in community. And discussing grief and shame and things like that is really uncomfortable in a very individualistic society. But when you recognize that my grief is the same as his grief, as your grief, as everyone's grief, and that it's like such a human experience, and that shame is a human experience, that we all feel these things, if we can recognize that and experience that in community with people, and recognize like how beautiful that is, and that grief is the same, is just an expression of love, and shame is just an expression of like, I don't know, like our desire to be ourselves the best that we can. Because I mean, when I think about shame, it's like I feel shame for all of the times that I was like off track of who I was, and I wasn't in my authenticity. And everybody can relate to that. That's like totally relatable. All of these things are, but they're scary when we think we're alone, and that we're isolated, and that we're not in relationship. But we always are connected to everything else. And so I just think that's like, that's the best way we can deal with these things, is to talk about it, and to be open, and to recognize that our bodies are like expecting to grieve with people.
Yeah.
And
I think also one of the worst things about being in such a death-phobic culture is that we're grief-phobic as well. If we think about how funerals are conducted, not only is it sanitizing to the fact that somebody's dead, but it's kind of embarrassing or shameful or almost inappropriate to openly grieve and show a full range of sorrow at a funeral. Like, some crying's okay, but keep it together, keep it together for everybody else. Like, we don't have any sense of grief in our culture. And I think until we at large truly grieve for what we've done to the world, truly grieve for what this society's done to our lives, our loved ones' lives, what is probably going to continue happening, until we truly feel that, we're not going to solve the problem. We have to truly mourn that, and at the same time have a bit of an Irish wake about it.
Yes.
You got to feel that grief, but get the party started real soon, because the more fun we have, the sooner we can get past all the bullshit. But we have to feel those things first and tell the good stories of what it was like. You know, I mean, the amount of species that have gone extinct, the amount of forests and ecosystems that are now irrevocably gone is tragic. And it's really, really, really hard. And it hits me all the time, and it keeps me up at night. But the more I feel into that, the sooner I get to this place of determination and love for what's left and passion to want to change things and make it better. And I feel like we've only reserved the grief for the living world for the extremists or the emotional teenager who throws milk on the floor at supermarkets. We've reserved it for them, and they're making a spectacle of what grief can actually be as a whole. And we really haven't felt that grief. We've reserved some hope that we won't have to feel the grief, because we're going to save it. Technology is going to come and save the day. We're going to save those last forests, the last bits of biodiversity, and it's just going to come back magically. But we've never said, you know, what if it doesn't? What if this all dies? And we've never felt that, like, grief. We've never allowed ourselves to truly feel that, because we think we have the technology to fix this. And I think we have to feel that grief. And I know it sucks and it's hard and we can't live in that grief, but you do have to feel it very deeply if you want to make the world a better place.
It's grief is alchemical, though, you know, so it's like it opens up your heart for more love if you let it. Grief can absolutely make you shut down and shut off and not want to participate. But if you let it, it just like opens up your chest cavity, and it's just like, okay, there's even more space for love now, because now I know what it feels like to have loss and to love and to know what it feels like to experience pain. At least
it's gotta be like the most human thing we can do. It makes no sense to need to grieve,
and it makes no sense to hide it. It makes no sense to pretend like it's not there and pretend like we don't feel it and pretend like it's not the most common thing that like is, you know, like the very first written piece of literature that we have on Earth is a story of grief. I mean, the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's about his grief about his friend dying, you know? Like that's like so human. And until we can start to recognize that, like, that, you know, like if we don't actually grieve the things, and as you're saying, is if we're stuck in this sort of false hope, then we're never, our hearts are never going to open to the level of love and responsibility that we can actually have and actually implement. Like
the person's dead, like they died.
Yeah, and
your
like, and
father's
so what?
Dead.
Yeah, and so what life comes after the death of your loved one? What life comes after the death of your, like, sense of self, or the death of your culture, or something like that? Like, there's so much potential and generative, like, potential in death for the rebirth, but it has to be done intentionally. And that's the thing. That's like, it's like, you know, it's not going to happen on its own. We've been ignoring it for hundreds of years. We've been pretending like this thing doesn't exist. And it's like, no, you have to turn toward it. You have to turn towards the death. You have to turn towards the grief. That's the only way through this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well said, Jackie.
What do you think it could look like? Because I don't think there's one way to grieve, either as an individual, but really as a culture here. Like, I think what we're talking about is sort of cultural, wide-scale grief. What could that look like?
Well, I think what it would look like, if to know that it's happening, is that people are starting to walk away, and people are no longer believing the narratives, and people are no longer believing in the false hopes and the false promises, and people are completely changing the way they see the world and the way they want to be in the world. I don't know what collective grief like that would look like, but I know what its repercussions would look like if it actually had happened.
I feel like the image that came to my mind is when my grandma died. Me and my mom sat Shiva for like 6 days, just like not showering, just having, you know, just eating and just sitting in the grief. And so I feel like what would happen is we would slow down. I feel like if we actually were grieving, we wouldn't be coming up with all of these technologies, and we wouldn't be coming up with all of these solutions, and we wouldn't be doing all of these conferences. We wouldn't be having billionaires come up with all of these like manifestos and action plans. We would all just be sitting in this shit and feeling things, and it wouldn't be this I think a lot about Charles Eisenstein talks about like this like pregnant space between stories, and it's like this uncomfortable thing, but you just kind of have to sit with it. You have to just like be pregnant and uncomfortable, and then the rebirth can happen. But until we start slowing down and having these kinds of conversations and really asking ourselves like what our values are and where do we agree with the direction that society is going in response to these problems, I don't think that we're ever going to solve anything. And I definitely think that people are not grieving. I think people think that they're grieving because they're upset about what's happening in the world, but they're imposing all of these programs of control that to me just makes me think that they're in denial. And you know, how do you save like landscapes? You go be with that landscape and you understand that landscape and you understand your part in it. You don't like put a fence around it.
You feel its death first.
Yeah.
You feel the death of that thing.
Exactly. Know? Yeah, you have to face that loss in order to do something productive with it. I mean, it's the same thing in relationships. It's like when you realize that your parents are going to die or that your loved ones are going to die, when you have that experience, it's only then that you recognize like, maybe I don't need to have this petty grudge. Maybe I can move on from this thing. Maybe my love for them is more important than our differences. And maybe I can find a way to show up in that relationship, even if it's not 100% what I want it to be, because it's more important to have the connection than for it to be this, you know, like individualistic, like, why doesn't everybody understand me, blah, blah. Like, you know, but you have to like acknowledge that those people are going to be gone one day. And so it's like, there's so much tied into this that again, it's as above so below, you know.
Which then you have to take responsibility for how you show up in that relationship with that person. And I mean, again, so much of this asks you to take responsibility for your relationships with people, with Earth, and to be there. I mean, if you go and sit in that national park and recognize that it's dying, then you recognize that some aspect of you is dying too, right? That it can't be any different than that. You can't tease apart because it's all connected. And so if part of that is dying, then part of me is dying, and a part of everyone else is dying too. And death is nourishment. It is the nourishment that allows life to continue. We need death to build soil organic matter, to return nutrients and particles back to that space, to create something again, to recycle through something. And I want to pull in practicing dying, because I think that as we look at this, I mean, a lot of us are going through these mental practices of death. And Maren, you wrote this gorgeous essay that I didn't put the name of on here.
What is it called? Oh, we're only passing through, I think.
We're only passing through. That's what it is. I'm going to read a piece, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit about practicing dying. I didn't have this language at the time, but I was practicing. I was practicing dying. Intuitively and with so much wisdom, my body was initiating me into death, something which, at the time, I didn't think would come to punctuate my life. I died again in the bathtub one day, in the dark, thrashing and screaming, an upwelling of pain so unbearable I truly thought I might die. I'm going to mispronounce this word. This is Negredo. Is that Negredo? Yeah. This is Negredo, I said into the darkness. Negredo, 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 like a prayer. I was composting, putrefying. I was waiting for the worms. I was dying. I was dying so I could be reborn. Why don't we hold funerals for our passing selves? Is it enough that we sometimes feel between sips of tea or in moments of silence that we are not the same as we once were? Shouldn't we give ourselves more space to grieve and rejoice at the passing on of life and the rebirth that comes with it? Shouldn't we name it? Shouldn't we worship it? We practice dying when we understand that entropy doesn't exist. Not really, not the way we think. That which can only exist in a vacuum does not exist at all, as even in the deepest reaches of space there is matter, there is relationship. The death-denying delusion is that the end of me as I know myself is the end of everything. Life is not a beginning, nor is death an end. These are merely stages of cycles, small orbits within larger orbits. I am merely the story of one woman in a sea of billions of people, in an ocean of trillions upon trillions of life forms, living and dead and yet to be born, a consciousness which will ultimately be converted to carbon and converted into life yet again on a timescale that is incomprehensible to me.
Nice.
Maybe I am a writer.
You just need somebody else to read it back to you. That's the thing. That's the thing.
I'm like, damn, that's pretty good. Yeah. I think like one of the things that I did want to say, is that it is so imperative that we experience the death of ourselves throughout our lives, and have such a conscious awareness of the fact that we are going to physically die, because it opens up so much potential and possibility. It opens up life. It opens up, if I was afraid of dying, I don't think I could do this project, because I think that I would be in such a state of fear about, I need to go get a mortgage and a car that works well, and it's like I would be doing all of these things that are illusory solutions, and they don't actually provide you with any security at all. And I think that's the sort of cosmic joke of it all. But it helped to learn how to die throughout my life, so that I could know that even doing something crazy like trying to make a movie or write a book, or just living the way that we do, and the opportunities that we've been able to accept, I don't think I would be able to do it if I was really, really scared of dying. And, I'm really grateful to these experiences in my past that gave me a compass in that sense. And I've been thinking recently about and I don't know if this is just an archetypal thing that's just associated with women, but I do think it's interesting, because there is a lot of women who do this, but there's a lot of, you think about doulas and midwives. There's these women who are life workers. There are women who are sex workers. Mm-hmm. And then there are also people who are death workers. And I've been thinking recently, it's that there's something really important to me about death. And I think maybe that's part of some sort of archetype that I'm nesting into, where death has just been a really important thing in my entire life. And I didn't really realize it until I wrote this piece. And I was I realized that there has been some sort of intuitive calling for me to try to understand this thing, and to come to terms with it, and to face the horror and the terror of it, and just try to be brave in that space. And I don't know, it's very empowering to feel, at least for me. And maybe not everybody needs to go on this journey that we went on with death, but that's why we're doing Death in the Garden the way that we are. Is but this was our journey, and this is an important journey. Maybe there are other people who have who are more on the light side, or more on the sex side, or something like that, or maybe there's all these other sides to it, but there's all these facets of life, and we have to give them all attention. And I just think that death is something that's been really, really maligned and really misunderstood, and heartbreakingly so, because I think that I in that piece I talk about wishing I was even more prepared for my grandma's death, wishing I had even had more awareness of how to show up in that space. And that's something that I think we also expect. I think that we expect to grow up in a village where there's people dying around us all the time, and we know what that feels like, and we have that experience. We know what it feels like to kill animals. We know what it feels like to have all of the psychedelic, insane connection to divinity that death brings. I think we expect that. And so then when we show up in that space and it's totally foreign realm, it's hard, but I learned a lot from my grandma's death, and how I want to show up for my parents' death, and how I want to show up for my loved ones' deaths. And, I think I wrote in there something, it's just talking with so much reverence and love, and it sounds probably morbid, but just thinking about like with so much gratitude, like the friends that I will bury and the animals I will kill and the loved ones I will like sit in that space with, to me is like, it's so important. And that's like my expression of love is like, is through that grief and like being willing to be a witness to it.
Absolutely. And as you're talking too, I'm thinking, you know, if you can't even imagine your ultimate death, you can't even allow the little deaths that come throughout your life. You know, I think if you and I, when we met and when this project was starting, if we weren't allowing a version of ourselves to die, we would have never come into this newer part of ourselves. And we sure as hell better be prepared whenever it comes for another little death of not only our individuals, but a version of our relationship, or the fact that the part of our lives in which we were just working on Death in the Garden comes to the close. And I think so many people never let themselves die, and therefore never let themselves step into the new life, the new thing that's waiting for them. And I think if we fear the real death, then we're afraid about like actually
all the
what
little
comes
deaths.
next. Yeah, exactly. And the little deaths. Yeah, exactly. And I think it's a good practice to think about death. You got to let yourself die a few times in your life to prepare for the final one.
And to allow yourself to be transformed. I want to tease out one little piece of what you said, because I had this image you were talking about. There's, you know, doulas and there's life and sex and death, but I think in many ways those are just the three legs of the stool, like whatever the stool is that we're sitting on, like life and sex and death, they're all a part of it, and you cannot tease them away from one another, both on a literal level, like you have to have death to have life. You have to have sex to have life. And they're all linked in these spaces. And I mean, even within the space of what we talked about when I came on your podcast they call an orgasm, le petit mort, right? The tiny death, that it is something that can bring us closer to our divinity, that all of these things can bring us closer to our divinity, the divinity of the greater divinity, and all of these different pieces, and they are all transforming infinitely through one another. Yeah. And I think as women with the potential to create life, we in some ways are closer to that veil of death.
Yeah, and we can do all of the things, you know, like that is something that men unfortunately are unable to do, is, you know, like we can have the experience of sex, birth, and death. And men can only really do the death and the life part and the sex part.
Well, I think that we were talking about this last time we spoke with you, which is you know, why, and I think this is indicative of the culture at large, we want to control women, and the society has been so male dominant and hierarchical, and that we have placed so many taboos on women, their behaviors, their intuition, and their bodies, is because it represents the things that our culture hates the most and that are the most riddled with taboos in our culture. And when you're around women, you have no other option but to be faced with those truths and those realities. Yeah. And, you know, and just in a birth, you can have all of the things. You can have birth and death at the same time. Yeah. You know, and I think, you know, women represent so much that is uncontrollable and irrational to the largely masculine mind that is prevalent in our society. And that's something that we really have to get to grips with, because
order and chaos.
The way to the next. Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
That's how they're recommended. Yeah. That's how they're represented in the Taoist symbol of yin and yang, or yin and yang, is order and chaos. And the known and the unknown.
Day and night also, you know. Like, those sorts of mythologies and those like archetypal understandings of masculine and feminine, like, they're real and they're important. And, you know, it's the integration and recognition of the differences that I think can allow for both of the highest expressions and the highest octaves of each to come out, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, like because there is so much benefit to masculine energy, and there's so much benefit to feminine energy. But the recognition of like holding those two things as truly equal, not in like the kind of pathetic way that like the government tries to create like equality. You know, it's like, no, this is like deep work. This is like deep understanding of who we are as humans.
And what would a society actually look like if those things were actualized? I think it would be incredible to know what those things were actualized in the world. It'd be really amazing, but it's going to take a lot of hard work.
Totally.
And a lot of responsibility. We're again, on that part of the journey where it's going to take a lot of ownership and responsibility to enact those things and to bring them into equal footing and equal reverence. To have reverence for the masculine now, I think is not out of balance with reverence for the feminine, but to again reclaim some reverence of that.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I like that you bring it back to responsibility, because that's one thing that our good friend Jorgen, who is a shepherd in Sweden, he's one of our favorite people ever, but he's always saying, imagine a world in which everybody was responsible. That's it. You just have to be responsible. And when you're responsible for life, when you're responsible to what gives you life, and when you're responsible of what continues the magnificent cycle of life, then that's when we can really make some progress. If we're responsible, we have to know what that means. I think the younger you are, the more abhorrent you are to the word responsibility. Even I am like, oh, responsibility. But I think if we can,
syndrome.
Yeah. But I think if we can understand what that means, again, to go back to the journey of eating meat again, when I look at a steak now, I can't not feel really responsible. I see it. I know what that is. And if I'm not responsible, I get really grossed out by that piece of meat. And if I'm not actually taking as many steps as I can to honor, respect, know where it came from, honor the farmer, honor the animal, honor the landscape, the grasses and the soil, to the best of my ability at that time, then I start like, well, veganism wasn't such a bad idea after all. But the more I'm responsible, the more I can really live into what that means, the symbolic nature of eating and dying and defecating.
Yeah, and I think responsibility is another one of those like false summit types of things too. It's like you have to be careful of like, actually making sure that you finish the climb. And so I love, I think I might have said this when we interviewed you for our podcast, but Nora Bateson talks about like, what is the edge of me? And the edge of me is everything else. Like, there is no edge to me. Like I'm connected to everything. And so, therefore, if I take what Jorgen said and what we're saying here now is, like, if I'm responsible, that means I'm responsible for a lot of things. Like, that means I'm really responsible to, like, everything that I buy, everything that I put in my body. I'm responsible to, like, the way that I show up in my relationships with everybody in my life. I'm responsible for what I say. And I think that can be really overwhelming to people. But, like, if, I think that it's really imperative that we have to do the hard work. Like, yeah, our bodies were not designed, and our bodies and our minds were not designed to hold the complexity of the entire world. But unfortunately, that's what we're called to do. And I think that's why it's so important to sort of like eradicate this idea of individualism. And, there's some people who really want to like double down on that and be like, well, this is the next iteration. And in my opinion, it's like, no, that was the sidestep. Like, that all that does is make me think that if I'm an isolated individual, then I'm not responsible. And it's like, if you recognize that you were not an individual and you never were, then suddenly your realm of responsibility, your realm of care, and what the earth is asking of you, what God is asking of you, however you want to understand why you're here on earth, you have to be responsible to even like answer that call. And we have this like really pathological society that makes it seem like your calling is just like your career or like, what you decide to go to school for. And it's like, no, this is so much deeper than that. And it's so much more fun than that. It's more profound than that. And it's all of these amazing things. But you have to recognize that you're not an individual and that you're going to die. And if you don't do those two fundamental things, then I don't even know where you can start.
I have this great quote that I think is really relevant here from you, Maren. I see myself as an individual, but the paradox is that individuation can only happen in community. A tree is only a tree when connected to everything that's around it. The squirrel that makes its home in the hollowed out spaces, the ants that eat from the leaves, the mycelium that connects its roots to the shrubs and grasses that surround it. A mountain is only a mountain because of wind, water, and fire, and relationships. Oh, and similarly, those elements cannot exist without their opposites. Everything is relationships. Everything is relating. All are relatives. If I am actually an individual, I am nothing, even death, I am not nothing. Even in death, I am relationships. The other paradox is that in death, I am creating space for life. Death without life, without death, is nothingness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, you're doing a good job.
2024.
You're doing really good.
Wait
Yeah.
for it, ladies and gentlemen. So
It's going to be great. I can't wait for it.
I love hearing you read it, though. It's so nice.
Yeah.
It's nice.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. I thank you. It was such a delight to just sort of revel in all of your writing.
She's been killing it lately.
I want to go back to... Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, you go ahead.
I want to go back to something that Jake said because I want to pull food back into this. And I think that this is really important because I think our relationship with food is in many ways a relationship to death and is one of our most intimate relationships. Intimacy in one definition is a union of particles. And I constantly find that through being a butcher, through the work that I've done, that our relationship to what we eat is intimate, and maybe that is why it is so fraught and tender at times and so dogmatic. And this is something that we put inside our bodies, right? This is a very literal manifestation of breaching the boundary of what we perceive as self and integrating other into self. It literally passes through a 1 cell thick gut lining, the nutrients from our food to inform our biology, to become a part of us. And so when we're talking about food and death and defecation and all of these different things, it is part of it. To eat is part of death.
Yeah, I mean, you said it all right there, and that's why I think, I never thought I was going to be so interested in food when I was 19. But somehow it's like my world, and I'm not a good chef, I'm not, some cuisine expert, but for me it really is, it's this ceremony we do every day, and it should be a ceremony, and it should be wrought with intent and focus, because it is a spiritual, symbolic item, especially meat. I can't think of anything more symbolic on earth other than looking at a raw piece of steak and truly understanding what that is. And, in my time with the Hare Krishnas, there was one thing at the time I thought was silly, which is they practice bhakti yoga, which is, in general, it's everything you do is done with Krishna in mind. It's done with God in mind. It's done with love in mind. And so when you're working with the seeds and you're growing the food and you're working in the gardens, all the way up to harvesting and eating that food or cooking and preparing that food, you're praying and you're trying to do it with love and focus. And there's many aspects of that at the time which are salient and maybe still are, but the idea behind really everything you do around food is how you're going to do it in the rest of your life and how you see the rest of life and how you see the sacredness in life and how you see your own self and how you respect yourself. I think I've said this for a while to Maren, that if people really honored and respected and took the food that they ate every day really, really important and high on their list of priorities of intent, then I think that's one of the biggest doorways to transformation ever. And so quite often, I'm grateful that I had negative health stuff go on in my youth, because it forced me to have to really look at this thing and be grateful for it. And not just in a physical biochemical way, but in a spiritual relationship type of way. And so I always encourage people like, damn, like you really got to think about food. You really have to focus on that, because it can really change the way you live your life and the way you think about your life. It can change your whole life. It can make you change completely different career paths, different lifestyles. It can be very transformative. And I think we have completely devalued food. And we have, obviously we have stores and schools full of Doritos and crappy food, and we don't care. That is the least thing of importance of our day, is just get some calories in. And we see food just as calories, not as, let alone nutrients, first of all, but also relationship and how you are interacting with the people who grow those food, and it's really how you interact with the rest of life. Because say you live out in the woods, you have to chop down some wood for fire, and you got to build a house, and that's you're definitely interacting with nature in that way, but what you choose to eat is the way you're really communicating with the rest of the living world. Who you choose to eat is how you communicate with the rest of the living world. Sometimes it really trips me up that vegans don't want to eat meat, but they'll buy a giant jar of cashews from Costco, and what I see is that's a lot of little babies, and those little babies were peeled by prisoners in Vietnam that were grown in giant monocultures, and the interaction with the tree was purely extractive, and all that tree wanted was for you to plant a few of those little babies, and it would give you some of those babies, but you put it in a plastic jar and watched the Super Bowl and ate them all. And so, for me, that missed kind of calibration of like, no, all food is important, all food is sacred. Where it all comes from is very, very important. How it's done is important. We were watching this, there's this great show called Chef's Table, and each episode is done on like a different chef. And I don't know if you've seen this, but there's this Thai woman who is really trying to connect with real Thai food, not the tourist version of it. And what she finds is it's really dying. There's very little actual Thai food left because even in Thailand, they've catered to the Western palate. They don't have the spices, and they don't, most Thai food has sugar in it. But the way they would do it traditionally was a very artisanal farmer who would have a few of these palm trees that he would collect a little bit of this sugar from. And every day he would boil it down and refine it into this little nectar that was put in traditional Thai food. And so she goes through this process of finding one of these last guys who's actually doing sugar this way. And it was such a cool thing because that was his world, and that was his gift to the world, and that was his gift to nature, was doing it right. These trees are going to have this wonderful life where they're protected and they're in part of a larger ecosystem, and they're going to give me some of that sugar, and that sugar is going to feed somebody, and that sugar is going to make the person who ate that sugar so grateful from the fact that they come from Thailand and that taste is available to them from the tree next. It can do that for you. And we bought a whole cow recently, and I was like, wow, I'm eating Utah. I am eating the landscape, and I just you can taste it, and it's different, and that's what food does to me, and that's the symbology of food to me. And to me, compared to who I was 5 years ago, that was not even on my radar. Even when I was a vegan, it was like, thank God this is a dead leaf that was never alive or conscious, and I'm not killing something. And hopefully it's good for me. That was about it. But now I have what I just described as my relationship.
Yeah, and it's like the cheapening of food. It's just like it's everything is a reflection of everything else. It's like the cheapening of food matches the cheapening of everything else about this culture. And it's again, it's an example of like the technologies that the culture makes reinforce the culture. We wrote in this piece that we just did about AI, talking about how if you look at Doritos as food, then you're not going to know what it like why it's so different to eat like a loaf of sourdough bread that your neighbor made for you or something like that. You're not going to know how different that is and how like meaningful that actually is. Or, if you never buy a piece of original art from an artist that, is in your community, you're going to think that the art that you bought from Target is the exact same. And so it's like this, it's all tied into this sort of consumer culture too, but it's this cheapening effect. And when I say cheapening, I'm not meaning like a monetary cheapening. I'm talking about a cheapening of like, of like our soul and our values and our understanding of like what is beauty and what is life and what is like meaningful. And I find a lot of gratitude from the journey of going through this journey with food as the sort of entryway, because what it does for so many people, not just us, like literally like so many people, is it takes you to this place where you want to feel what is real. You want to know what's real. And you start really paying attention to that, and you start to understand the importance of those types of things and the importance of connection with food. Even just going to the farmer's market every week, because we finished our cow, the part of the cow that we split with our family, and every week that I go to the farmer's market, because that's kind of like all that's available for us in our current living situation as far as connecting with food. It's such a joy to go and support my local farmers, and I know that they're putting in so much work, and it's not the end all, that there's more work to be done as far as like making sure that farmers are actually paid for what they do and that they're actually able to do the good work that they want to do. But even just that connection is so nice. and feels so much more aligned than anytime I go to the grocery store and it's this like sanitized robotic thing that just feels like, you know, like what are we doing? Like how did we normalize this so much? It has no soul, it has no heart.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's really why all conversations about climate change and civilization and all these philosophies always come back to this point when we started industrial agriculture, because that's the moment that relationship changed. That's the moment when we saw our food not coming from the web of life, but from our aggressive toil of that web of life.
Yeah.
And that there is some, whether we know the actual historical events of that moment, that time in human history is so symbolic in so many ways.
You know, and even looking back, you know, it's like it's almost more like the Industrial Revolution. It just like was like the nail in the coffin, you know, but like even thinking about the animism and the connection that people feel to the land, that villagers around the world feel to the land, is totally different than the way that we feel consuming industrially produced products. Like it's a completely different relationship. And so it's like it's not even like I think sometimes when we talk about agriculture as like this event that happened 10,000 years ago, we forget that it's like it's happening now, and there's ways to reconnect with it now, and that the industrialization was like, you know, it's only been like 250 years. Like, you know, our great grandparents like would be completely bewildered to be in the world that we live in today. So it's like, it's interesting. It's just, you know, we're closer to the thing that feels right than we think, I think sometimes. I think it feels like it's like, especially when people talk about it, it's like, we need to go back all the way to the Paleolithic in order to like be happy and, you know, live good lives. And it's like, no, that's actually like, I think that gets us farther away from the moment now, and actually how much abundance we could be creating now, and how much is still here, you know, how much varieties of like ancient grains still exist, and how we can start normalizing that in our life. And that so we can start normalizing knowing our farmers, or like, you know, I like in California how there's just goats on the highway, you know, like eating the grass and stuff, and like normalizing that sort of thing, and just normalizing the connection to food that we can have. It's not, we don't have to have either this technotopian future or go back to the Paleolithic to like live a good life. Like there's things that can happen in the here and now.
Yeah, there's an in-between. I have found that my relationship with food is the door that keeps opening, right? It's the door I keep it's crawling through and finding another door, getting closer to that thing that is whatever you want to call it, whether it's rightness or truth. And that often is what the impetus for that door appearing is, my relationship with food. I have to ask this question because this is something that's really been on my mind, is that there's such an interesting idea in the more vegan vegetarian community of this sort of purity of food or the high vibration of food. But I have found that in connecting with meat, that is actually the space where I connect the most with the aliveness of my relationships with food, which maybe that's a higher vibration, I don't know, or of that sacred relationship that is cast because I am incorporating death. And there is this space of death. I think there's death in vegan and vegetarian eating too, but I've been noodling on this lately. And I feel like you both have always been noodling on this. So
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a really interesting part of the vegan conversation, because it's not for everybody. It's not everybody about the purity thing. There are plenty of people who think it's just healthy or better for the planet or more ethical, but there is a lot of people, and I usually find it in the people who stay in the longest despite extra information or negative health ramifications. The people who stay in the longest is because of people who were told that it would detoxify their body, make them more pure, therefore live longer, and attain a even higher and separate order of being than even lowly humans. You become slightly angelic. And I probably fell into that camp for a while too, and I know a lot of friends who think that one day they will become breatharians and they won't have to eat at all. They will transcend the constraints of physical reality. And that's where I think the truth lies, is that, to go back to the abhorrence of death, food and therefore defecating remind us that we're physical and remind us that we're limited and remind us that we're going to die and remind us of that we're probably going to get sick. And so if we can find a way of escaping even consumption and live off of pure life force prana, then we have also therefore abated death. And for me, leaving veganism, the death-denying aspects of veganism was the most fascinating. It's like, okay, people are going to fight the diet wars till the end of time. That's fine. Everybody should find what works for them. I found it works for me. Clearly, we need animals on the land to protect the environment. Is it really more ethical to cut down the biggest wetland in North America and just grow almonds there now? Is that really like a better option? But what really people could not talk about and couldn't get stuck on, and what gave me the most unsettling feeling was like, shit, now I'm like a carnal mortal being. Like, it's real. Like, I can't ignore that anymore. I'm gonna die, and things die for me to live. And so the purity, higher vibration part, I understand the impetus, because so much of our world does make us feel gross, and we do know we're being poisoned, and we do know that our environment is toxic. And I can't blame people for eating a hamburger from the grocery store and feeling like, wow, I'm like less of a spiritual being, because that is kind of a gross act. But I think I agree with you more now, where, again, to come back on the full journey is now where how I see meat and where I get my meat makes me actually feel way more in tune with nature, way more in sync, way more in communication, way more in touch with myself. And we were talking with somebody else on their podcast, and it's like, I feel way more spiritual now eating meat from the meat itself than I ever did on a vegan. When I was vegan and so nutrient deficient and crazy, I was angry and bitter and so disconnected from my intuition, because I had to lie to my intuition every day to think that like I was doing okay. But then once I started eating meat again, I felt so grateful to feel better. And that gratitude was like nothing else. Like, oh, thank God. Like, thank you, animal, because I feel so much better and I don't feel like shit anymore. And that gratitude made me just feel way more in line with spirituality and to God and to creation. That the gratitude that like the universe would allow something to die for me to feel really good and really strong and feel healthy. Like, wow, that's a trip.
As you were talking, I was just thinking about like how interesting it is that so many of our conceptions of purity in this current iteration of society is based around like abstinence and celibacy and stuff like that, and how it's like it's shameful to have like a sex drive. It's shameful to engage with death and have some sort of a relationship with death. It's shameful to kill things. That's like against one of the commandments. It's like there's all of these like parallels with religiosity and death, like the death denying aspects of veganism and vegetarianism. And I'm just thinking about how too like you didn't. Is it okay that I say this?
Yeah.
That you didn't have a sex drive when you were vegan, and how like then when you started eating meat, your sex drive came back, and it's like. And so it's like there's this like belief that the spiritual plane exists somewhere outside of like the corporeal plane, whereas like in my view like all of those things are entwined. And so it's like how could you feel spiritual if you like can't have an orgasm, or how can you feel spiritual if you are disconnected from death and you don't even know what that feels like? If you think that every time you're eating you're not killing anything, like how can you actually attain any kind of real relationship with spirit, with God, with whatever?
Exactly. And you often find in the spiritual vegan communities the self-imposed celibacy, abstain from what makes us physical and carnal.
Yeah. And so it's just like it's another example of that death-denying delusion.
And it's interesting, too, because you brought up shame, that there's this shame in those things. And what you said earlier was shame for you has been, and I was really struck by this, and it was really medicine for me to hear. Shame is when you've felt out of alignment. And so to bring that into the conversation makes that quite poignant, that shame comes in when we feel out of alignment with our nature, which I think is to eat, to have sex, to enjoy the carnal pleasures of this life. This is what we have, right? Like that is joy, is to eat food, to have sex, to do all of these things that remind us that we are alive and here, present, right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like avoiding those things is just maintaining your sense of being out of alignment. And, is it any wonder that so many of these things, when we talk about these things, shame is like the thing that like is trying to always tamp it down. Like you need to be ashamed if you have premarital sex. You need to be ashamed if you eat meat, if you kill things. And I think, it's like, I think that like the most responsible thing that we can all do as human beings is be like, yeah, we're like these like primates that kill things, and that's okay. It's not a bad, we're not evil for doing that. Like that's not bad. Like why do we act like this is like the most shameful thing? What's shameful is the way that we do it to pretend like we're not killing things, And so for me, like when I killed, I haven't had as much experience with death as I want to and I hope to have in my life, as far as killing animals, because I mean, I see this whole like trajectory ahead of me that's just going to be so imbued with like meaning and death and stuff, which I really look forward to. But, the experience of killing my first animal and being responsible for that moment, I mean, that was a hugely spiritual moment, hugely. And everyone who you talk to, who, like everyone we've talked to has this same exact reaction, or they're just like desensitized to it, not in a bad way, but they're just like, no, this is just part of life. It's okay. It's it's not as big of a deal as everyone's making it out to be. And I think that there is a balance there. But for me, I feel so grateful that I've had the experience to kill something. And I hope to have more of those experiences because I know that that's me taking responsibility. Like I don't like the fact that even the food we buy from the farmer's market, that has to go through the USDA system in order to get packaged so that I can eat it. And so that cow that I'm eating didn't have the good death that the sheep did that I killed. It didn't get to the chance to die on the land that it was raised on. It didn't get to die amongst its community in a dignified, reverent way. And so for me, it's like, if I'm actually responsible for the death that's required for me to live, then like I want to be part of changing the USDA system so that we can start having these like home-based abattoirs again, so that people can start doing field slaughters and be able to share that sort of meat with their community. And like those are integral aspects to us being able to really be responsible for our food. And it's like it can't exist within the industrial food system. It just doesn't. And that's why I feel that a lot of the vegan and vegetarian arguments really like obfuscate what we're actually being called to face, which is the deindustrialization of all food. And that includes the strawberries that are raised in California or the almonds or the rice or whatever it is. It's like that's what we're being called to reckon with, is how has the machine taken over this beautiful relationship that we can have with what gives us nourishment. And I loved what you said about like it being that the like liminal space of like turning something else into the self. I think that's like so beautifully said. Yeah,
that was really good. Yeah.
Yeah. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. It's just, it becomes us. Like we are connected completely. I mean, complete union with that thing. Maybe even more of a complete union than we can have in sex. Maybe only the kind of complete union that would be rivaled by something like pregnancy and birth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Wow.
To truly share space at that cellular, biological level and to be changed.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's a very intimate relationship you have with food.
I love that.
Yeah.
I think this is great. I have one last little piece that I can't leave alone because I was so struck by you saying this, and I don't want to close it with talking about controlling death, but I think so much of what we've talked about is, and that's been a big part of my journey, has been a desire to coming from that desire to control, of not wanting to engage with death. And you said something on a podcast, Jake, and I like immediately came home and I had to tell my husband about this latent archetype of those that control death, and that being the Darth Vaders, the Voldemorts. And
Yeah.
this relationship then, I mean, that kind of to me says that there's a relationship between trying to control death and the ways in which we have maybe personified, I don't want to call it evil necessarily, but I mean, in many of these things, personified this personification and teasing that out.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes, this is. I love this topic. It's a fun one because I find obviously culture very fascinating. You know, for example, I love going to a new city, and I always look for the street art, but like the real art, not just like graffiti, but like the hidden murals that just never get taken down for whatever reason. Because I feel like they always express something you need to know about that place, kind of what the subconscious is in general doing, and then the artist comes and is like this awesome vessel that is able to reflect back to that city what the gripes or what the beauties of that place are. And in the same way, I'm so fascinated by the stories and the narratives that for whatever reason take hold. You know, let's take Harry Potter, for example. You know, are they well-written books? Yes. Are they fun to read? Are they adventurous? Yes. But other than that, in many ways, it's just like another kid's story. But we can't underestimate that, you know, for our generation, the post 9/11 generation, you know, J.K. Rowling is the first, or if not the second most read author in all of human history, next to the Bible. Like, it's like for whatever reason, those stories took hold like wildfire and still are. Every year we like either listen to the books or watch the movies because they were such an important part of our childhood. And so I'm always, and if you think about this 70s and 80s with the Star Wars movies, why did those, it wasn't just that they were fun special effects, the archetypal philosophical principles of those stories took hold. And I really think it has to do with the villains of these stories. You know, so I think the villains of the stories, and also, you know, if you look at, you know, the reason why my generation just was obsessed with Harry Potter, you know, we all watched the towers go down, and we all grew up in this world in which everything had been denuded and stripped down, and the magic was taken away. And we were offered a story about a boy, a child who survived the most cruel acts and was saved by love and magic, and then was invited into a world in which there was meaning and mystery and magic that we were all sensed around us that was devoid in the suburban hell that we were all living in. And the pinnacle of that story, whether we knew it or not, represented, the evil character represented why the magic had been taken away, why it had been stripped away. It's the same with Vader, why the evil empire was created. These two characters, Voldemort and Darth Vader, at all cost wanted to avoid death, their own death, and in Vader's version, the death of his loved ones. Voldemort wanted his own immortality to the point that he would split his soul excruciatingly 7 times and hide them with the most intricate magic so that he could control the world and would never die. And so this controlling of nature to avoid death caused the stripping of magic from the world and caused immeasurable amounts of suffering. And so the story of 2 young men, young kids really, having to go out and face the exact thing that caused the pain and the magic to be stripped away from the world is what causes generations of children to become obsessed with those stories. And I hope people understand that's why they resonated with those stories, and that that's what they should bring into their adult lives, is what those stories represented to them when they were children. And when that intuition was still alive, is that she tapped into some archetypes that the children of that day were experiencing and showed it to them in a creative, symbolic way. And I hope people, you know, unfortunately J.K. Rowling is being misaligned nowadays, which is a whole other topic. But I hope people can really think of why those stories meant so much to them. And I think it is fascinating that they are the two biggest villains of all of modern storytelling are ultimately death-denying individuals.
Yeah. It's so interesting, too. I was just thinking as you were talking, because, you know, like, the Darth Vader in particular, like, the Empire is all about, like, you know, the Sith Lords are all about, like, ordering the universe. Like, we have to control and maintain the whole universe. And, you know, how that was so much more about our parents' generation, and obviously it's impactful for us now. But then, you know, I grew up with more of the prequels, and you know, you're watching Anakin become Darth Vader, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we're watching that journey, and they probably could have done that much better, but like, you know, like because it is like, so it could be so much more archetypally like just potent. But then I think what ended up happening was with Harry Potter offers what I think we needed from the prequels to explain why Darth Vader is the way that he is.
Mm-hmm.
Like us getting this insight into Voldemort, and his inability to cope with death and grief. I mean, like Voldemort had like such a traumatic childhood and like background where he experienced all of this loss and trauma too, and then his the way that he expressed it obviously was very Darth Vader-y too.
Yeah, Harry and Voldemort have the same childhood and choose different paths. And
same with Luke and Anakin.
Yeah, and I will always have to give, you know, J.K. Rowling the biggest thanks for writing a character who was given the fate of the world, knew he had to die, and walked to his death to save his loved ones.
Yes.
That's a story for children.
Yes.
You know,
it's so good.
That is an adult story for children, and it's so good. And every time I read that part of the book, I sob because he finds out he's going to die.
Yeah.
And after all he's been through and having to do this every book, just like face his doomed one, lose a loved one again, he also accepts his death to ease the suffering of everybody else. And that's...
Yeah, it's seriously beautiful. Like it's so much more important than people want to believe it is. But we're actually in the middle of watching the movies right now for Christmas. We're
it
gonna
is
watch
the season.
The fifth one tonight. Yeah.
Yeah, they are. I used to read them occasionally, like every couple of years. I'll read the series again at Christmas because I grew up with it too. And
they're so good.
Thank you for that. That really, I learned a lot about myself, and I learned a lot about culture just in that little bit. That's something I really wanted to unpack. As we kind of start to wrap up, I don't want to end on that, but I keep hearing these pieces of journeys. Like, there's journeys, and there's villains and heroes, and there's order and chaos. And throughout this space, you've talked about what a journey the two of you have been on, both individually and together, as you embarked on this Death in the Garden project. And I wonder if you have words about how we go through journeys, like how we choose to go on them or take responsibility. I'm not sure what it is, but whatever resonates out of me saying all of those words jumbled together.
When you were talking about villains and heroes and stuff, you know, I do think that it's important for people to understand. I'm going to kind of frame this in the way that Robin Wall Kimmerer does in Braiding Sweetgrass. I forget, it's like the second to last chapter or something, but it's like her defeating Wendigo, which is this like cannibalistic monster that just comes and consumes everything. It's just this like monster that is destroying the world. And you know, the whole book she's talking about how Wendigo is like the footprints of Wendigo are everywhere, where this sort of industrial mindset and consumer mindset has sort of taken hold. And like I literally, when I read that the chapter, and if you haven't read this book, like, stop listening to what I'm saying because you need to have this experience for yourself. Turn this off now, or just like skip forward. The way that she defeats Wendigo, and it just like makes me emotional every time I think about it, because I cried so much when I read this chapter. As she feeds him and she loves him and she nourishes him. And I think what people need to understand is that right now there are a lot of people, humans who are really hurt and traumatized, that are doing evil things in the world, that are stuck in this Voldemort, Darth Vader mindset, and they are doing horrible things. But beneath that, there is like a deep, deep humanity. And if part of our journey can be viewing these villains as humans and figuring out how to bring them out of that, rather than just thinking that we can destroy the villains and that's enough. I think that's one of the most important parts of this story, is that we've had a whole history of heroes' journeys where you defeat the monster and you come back and you're reclaimed, and you've kind of alchemized certain things, and I think that that story is important. But I don't think that Voldemort can just be killed. I think that Voldemort has to be integrated. I think we have to understand the parts of ourselves that are that archetype, and the parts of ourselves that we are that we're not willing to face. And so we look at these things that are happening. The reality is like Darth Vader and Voldemort and all of the people who are enacting the story that we're being part of right now, they actually think that they're doing the right thing. They actually have like good intentions. It's just that good intentions can go really, really horrible in really horrible directions. And so being willing to see within ourselves our capacity to do horrible things in the name of doing good things, and seeing ourselves as villains and heroes too, and being able to integrate those two things, I think is so important. And we have to kind of write new myths around that.
I agree. And I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. And I think what came up for sorry, where you going?
No, I just want to give credence to that. Like, we are all both. I mean, what we've been talking about is relationships this entire time, that we contain, we contain everything. We can't tease ourselves out from all of this. And that villainy lives in all of us. And to recognize that, to maybe bring it out of shame, out of its separateness. Mm-hmm. And to love it. Mm-hmm. I'm just really appreciative of that.
Yeah. I think what came up for me when you asked that question is a few things. One, that I hope people walk away from this conversation really thinking about the fact that they are telling themselves a story. Whether they created it or not, they need to really think about their lives, because stories are the enacting of premises. And if we don't know the premise that we're trying to enact, then we don't know how to change our story. And our culture is doing that at large, and we're doing that as individuals, and it's important that we look at that. And two, I think it's more of like advice that, like, if you go on an earnest journey and you decide to go on a journey, it's much more fun to tell the story when it's over. Sometimes when you're in it, it blows, but you got to stay on the journey. There is a lot of fun and there is true adventure in there, but the stories get way better when they're over and you get to recite them.
Yep.
That's just kind of my bit of advice.
Oh, that is so true. This has been so great. Did I miss anything that's just burning a hole in your pocket?
That was fantastic.
No,
Yeah, that was
a
really great
good
conversation.
Yeah,
good.
I'm feeling like really regenerated.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Good. Yeah, so am I. Oh, this just filled my cup. My only regret is that we couldn't do it in person yet.
Yes.
Yeah, but we
tell people about Death in the Garden, where they can find you and the podcast. Obviously, all of this will be in show notes.
Yes, so the film is still in production, but likely will be out in a year, so just stay tuned for that.
Yeah, we've really gone on a journey with it, but really what we're trying to discuss with Death in the Garden is how are, like, all of the things that we talked about today, is like, how are we being subverted by the common narrative and the common story away from the true, like, what's actually at the core of what has created a problem such as climate change and ecocide and all of these things that we're experiencing today. Everything's at a fever pitch, and there's all these solutions that we're being given all the time for how to solve the climate. People say that, and I'm like, what do you even mean by that? Solve the climate. But so what we're trying to do is just we're just basically visually showing our journey of recognizing that this issue of climate change encapsulates so much more than carbon, and it encapsulates so much. It's so much more deep and philosophical and ingrained in our understandings of ourselves within the cosmos, within our own bodies, within ourselves. And we're basically just trying to describe that. We're just trying to take people on the journey that we went on, and we discuss the so-called solutions to climate change and talk about how those things aren't actually truly going to solve anything, and they're actually all just missing the point. And the point is to really get back to, like, what makes us human beings, and in that invariably you have to face the fact that you are going to die. And so that's what we're talking about. That's what the film's about. I'm going to try to write a book to accompany it. I shouldn't say try. I'm going to. I need to like hold myself accountable to that. It's just like I have so much imposter syndrome about being a writer.
Get out of here, lady.
You just send me stuff and I'll just read it back to you.
Yeah, exactly. You can be affirmed that it's good.
That's a good idea.
But you can find us on deathinthegarden.org. Our Instagram is Death in the Garden, one word. We have a Substack now, which is just Death in the Garden.
It's so good.
It's
so good.
It's mostly Maren's writing. It's great, yeah. And then we have a podcast called Death in the Garden as well, where we're releasing all of the interviews we're doing for the film, and they're full length, and then also some extra just fun conversations like this that we're sharing.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think, is there anything else? And we have a Patreon. If you liked this conversation, please take pity on us and send us money.
And if not, leave us a Spotify and Apple iTunes or Apple Podcast review. That's very helpful.
Mm-hmm. It is.
We can get those ratings up.
Yeah.
And also give Kate a good rating as well.
Give her money before us, though.
Yeah. No. I think everybody. I mean, I really think that this project is one of the most important things at this time, and I think supporting you guys through Patreon, through your Substack, which I would gladly pay for to receive those missives. It is just so stunning. So I encourage everybody to seek out your work, to seek out the interviews that you have done.
Thank you. And, and we feel so uncomfortable needing to ask for money, but it's like we just want to do this right, and we really want to do it so well. Yeah. And, it's just part of the culture that we live in right now, where money is a thing. Like, we all need it. And, so, but, like,
it's important,
even if people can't... Yeah.
To ask. And this is something we're all having to learn, right? Many of us are having to learn. It's important for people to better understand how they can support you and your work, and to ask for what you need to have that support, and to create an economy where currency, which is just a current, flows between some of these really beautiful ideas.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for having us on.
Yes.
Thank you
good.
for coming.
Thank you for the platform.
Thank
you for being our friend.
I know. Next time we're doing this in person. That's my big goal.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Likewise.
I think this summer we can.
We'll make it happen. We'll make it happen 100%.
Okay. Thank you guys.
Thank you.